I'm rating my 20 years experience as a professional designer to share with you the fundamentals of graphic design, layout, colour, typography in this mammoth 3-hour compilation. We've curated my most valuable videos on the subject, videos which have already enjoyed over 1 million views, into a collection which will take you from total beginner to a designer who's familiar with the essential principles. We'll cover how to choose fonts and typeset them, how to select colours, using grids, key design vocabulary and many other tips along the way. First up are my 9 principles of layout, the concepts that inform any successful composition. This is the first in a series of videos on the principles of layout, and in this lesson we're going to cover the first 3 ideas with examples. Just as a musician learns their instrument so they can more effectively share their vision, these principles provide boundaries within which creative expression can happen. They're not designed to limit your creativity, but to provide the opportunity for expression while still allowing you to fulfill the brief. You've probably heard of these, and we'll get into some more of the less talked about ideas in later videos, but it's amazing how often these basic principles are ignored, resulting in ineffective or just plain ugly designs. So I'll introduce these 3 concepts very quickly and then show you how they all work together in tandem with some examples. Number 1 is focal point, and this is the center of interest, not necessarily the center of the layout, and this is the location to which your eye is drawn. So, for example, here we have a white circle and it's right in the center of the layout, but if we move this to the side, it's still the focal point. Now, obviously, when you're watching this video, you can see me as well, hello, but considering this layout, it brings you over there. Even if we have multiple elements within the layout, we're drawn to the filled circle rather than the stroked ones. It's solid, it has more presence. So that's a focal point. Could also be where things meet. So here, the point at which the 2 lines intersect is a focal point. And you see this in things like photography. So a well-known principle about focal point is the rule of thirds, and photographers are taught to do this early. So in this image, the bird on the left is placed in the center, its head is placed in the center of the frame vertically and horizontally, whereas on the right not only can we see more of the bird, but the composition is more interesting because it is placed along these grid lines so that its head, or kind of that point of weight around the neck, is placed in the top third horizontally and the right third vertically, and it makes for a more interesting image than the one where it's just in the center. And you can apply this to layouts too, and we'll see that as all the principles come together at the end. But let me give you these quickly. Number 2 is white space, and this means quiet areas of visual rest which give you other elements room to breathe. And we saw this in the photograph of the bird. The blurred out background here provides the white space. White space doesn't have to be white, it just has to be a quiet area, and that allows us to focus on the part which is sharp and in focus, which is the bird itself. So just as music needs dynamics, that's loud and quiet, layouts need white space. The impact of the orchestra at full volume only works in a room where the acoustics are sufficient that the orchestra can play quietly and softly, and we have that different feel. And then when they burst into life with an incredibly loud, powerful dynamic, it has that impact. And it's the same with a layout. Areas of quiet, areas of white space allow other elements to come to the fore, and it makes them more interesting. It makes them easier to navigate around as well. And the third thing, before we bring these all together, is hierarchy. So this means giving priority to the most important elements. If everything's loud, if everything's on 10, again like music, then nothing is emphasized. When you're mixing a track, you can't just turn up everything louder. Just makes a wall of noise. So some things have to come to the fore, like when you're listening to pop music, the lead vocals in the fore, and some things have to be more to the background, a sense of hierarchy. And it's the same visually. Now, this is design 101. I appreciate that. But how often is this ignored in the real world? You want to orient your user. That means let them know where they are and then lead them on a journey. If you go to a map, maybe you're walking around a city as a tourist, the most important part is you are here. So they need to be oriented and be able to get their bearings of where they are, the layout, where north is perhaps, and then where they want to go. And with hierarchy, there's obvious things like headlines tend to be more prominent than body copy. But let's have a look at some examples. So here on this hero section for this website, the dominant element, the focal point, is the camera. And let's just annotate this. The camera here. So this is the dominant element. This is the focal point. And then there's plenty of white space around the image, but also around all the copy and such. So it allows you to read it. It gives parts of rest within this composition. And the headline here is clearly more prominent than the body copy underneath. And so there's a clear hierarchy to it as well as a clear focal point. So maybe with this next layout, similar with this next website. Again, so this time we don't have just a plain background. The photograph fills the entire background. However, there's still clear areas of white space within this photograph. It's nicely composed so that the cliffs really stand out because the sea and the sky give those white space areas. But then within the quiet areas, there's been space to place the logo, the navigation, the headline and the call to action very clearly. So we see this image, we get this feel, and then we read the headline, and it gives us a sense of the kind of website that we're on straight away. Similarly with this magazine layout, we see first of all the focal point, this big photograph which spans over from the right onto the left page of this arch. And as you're flicking through the magazine, this catches your eye as an eye-catching focal point for this photo essay, so it's going to lead you into that. So you see the picture and you get a sense, oh, this is going to be something from this American wilderness, which it is. Then the headline is clearly more dominant than the body copy, and there's also areas of white space. Not every cell within this grid has to be filled, and that gives chance for there just to be more of a sense of rest, and it gives it more of a premium, relaxed feel to it as well. Now, we can see this. These are made-up examples, okay, that are quickly put together. But you want to train your eye and be so that you are aware of these principles while you're learning, and so that when you look at a layout, you can see them at work and you can understand why a skilled designer made the decisions that they did. So let's look at some real world examples. So this is the hero section on the Figma homepage. So straight away we see the headline. It's at the top. It's big, it's bold. Now I've got a massive 5K screen here, so we see quite a lot of the image, but maybe on a smaller screen you just see a little bit of the screenshots here at the bottom below the fold. But we see the headline and there's plenty of white space around it, and things are sensibly placed and they're not crowding each other. So we get the concept of what Figma's about. They're making their unique selling proposition the collaboration aspect. So that's very clear at the top, and it leads us down through this. Same with Webflow, very similar. They have a headline. With Figma it was black on white. Here with Webflow it's white on black, or very dark. And that's very clear, and it's not crowded out by imagery. The site you want without the dev time. Their value proposition is very clear, and their logo is appropriately small. There's enough clear space between. They make their navigation very simple as well. It's just to log in or register, so that you are drawn to these key elements and they're able to get across their value proposition before encouraging you to scroll down the page by showing you within the app. Now, you're probably thinking these are both in the design community. Of course, they're going to have great websites, and more importantly, they're going to observe just like very basic principles of design. But what about the Pantone website? I mean, what is going on here? Like, I come here and I don't know where to look. There's so much going on. I've got to work. I've got to force myself to look around to figure things out. What is the focal point here? Perhaps the light booth over on the far right. It could be this. But we've got this type in the center, so that's like in the center at the top, so I'm sort of drawn to that. But then the biggest headline is here, so I'm not really sure. I'm kind of all over the place. And this hero section, which is actually a carousel, so these are rotating, which will distract you even more. So I've decided to take a screen grab for you guys. But then below, we've got like a big solid rectangle here. So this is very heavy. And this has got like 10 images in the thumbnail for this video next to something on a colored background. I mean, this type's in all caps and colored up. Two things that make type harder to read. Just so much going on. It's close to this nav, so it's competing. So if they would just go back to these very basic principles, focal point, hierarchy, white space, if they were observed and Pantone's value proposition and the sense of their brand came across, I mean, this is a brand for designers exclusively, fashion designers, interior designers, graphic designers. So it needs to look good. It needs to feel good. And Pantone do a really good job with their products and their merch. And that's not coming across in their website. And yes, they have products they need to push and things they need to talk about. But that could be done in an ordered grid layout, step by step throughout the website, or through an easily navigable menu. But to arrive here, this as a layout is an example of somebody not observing the basics. I've got 3 more principles for you in this video. Number 4 on our list is grouping. Instead of spacing elements out evenly, gather things that belong together. This helps the reader make sense of the information. We commonly see this on websites. So the navigation often appears at the top, the items are together. And here we have this on the Dribbble site, next to the Dribbble word mark, navigation to the different areas. In the top right, we have some separate items grouped. Often you get a search or a sign in or a basket on an e-commerce shop. Then below that, we have the hero section. We have their offer, their proposition, explore the world's leading design portfolios, headline and a byline and a call to action with some imagery next to it, white space around it. Clear focal point is the headline, things we talked about in part 1. And then below that are what they call the shots, or the different designs placed in a grid. So there's a clear grouping there of the navigation together at the top, then the hero section, and then the grid of content below it. And that might seem quite obvious, but it's something that often when you have a lot of information from a client, you need to do, and it will help you graphically make sense of things. There's a lot of messy posters out there, but in this one, this poster has a prominent headline, the artist name, and the practical information is grouped together at the bottom, the ticketing information on the bottom right and the when and where on the left. This helps emphasize what you want to emphasize. And it also makes use of the next principle, which is scale. Now, a good way to explain this, and Rand did a great little short on this, is if you have 3 elements that are all the same size, a better way, a more interesting way to present them compositionally is to have 1 large, 1 medium, and 1 small. So have things at different scales. So that is shown in these posters by the American studio DKNG. And this gig poster for Jack White, the illustration is the large element, the artist name medium, and the information at the bottom small. And the similar composition is followed. This next example, this poster for the Decemberists, and lovely illustrative work, but the composition is really vital to making these things work, and that sense of scale makes it more interesting, more dramatic, more aesthetically pleasing. So employ large contrasts in size if you want to add drama. Try huge headlines or small captions on images or full bleed images next to layouts with lots of white space. These sorts of tricks you see in fashion, advertising, things like that. I mean, just grab any design mag or fashion mag. I got Port Magazine here in the studio, and like the first advert spread when you just open the inside is this Hermes ad, and we have a lot of these principles we've talked about here: focal point, the model, employing the rule of thirds there that we talked about in the last video, but also scale. So this is a full bleed image, but it actually almost bleeds off the edge, you know, cropping off the model's head and body. But then this small caption here helps emphasize that element of large scale. So try out these kind of things on the web. Something like Apple's website, the iPhone 13 Pro page, we have the scale of the phone at this huge macro size, something more visually interesting. And as you go through the site, you see like the scale of the close-up shots with shots of the entire device with white space around it. And as you move through and play with scale, we have larger type for a paragraph, or then we have this area where we have a dramatic difference in point sizes to produce this dramatic effect. The headline is much larger type size than the body copy here. And we also have this scale principle of large, the photographs, medium, the headline, and small, the body copy. And this site also, and we'll go through it in a moment, makes use of the sixth principle, which is sequence. Now, a video editor understands the power of sequence. How you transition from one shot to another. Do you go from a wide shot to a close-up? The way things are moving, if they're moving from perhaps left to right, how does that affect the next shot? If they're then moving from right to left, will that feel a bit disorienting? And a movie that is edited well tells a story and it leads us through, and the sequencing of shots is really important to that. And we need to think about that too as designers when it comes to layout. So if you're leafing through a well-designed coffee table book, you have this cinematic effect because the layout moves around whilst leafing through, although it's perhaps all, or should probably be designed on the same grid, but that little bit of moving around adds that visual interest. It makes it more cinematic. And web designers should think similarly about a user scrolling down a page. So each panel, whatever's in view in the window, shouldn't be considered in isolation, but it should work both in isolation and as part of a sequence, telling a story. So let's have a look at that on a couple of websites right now. Maybe first of all with that Apple website for the i13 Pro. And as you scroll through, you see these principles of grouping. Obviously the menus grouped together at the top and things like that, but even the little, you know, links and things. And the idea of scale, we go huge type and then we have smaller type on these captions. And the idea of sequence, each panel looks well by itself, you know, the device dramatically on this big white field. But then we move into a full bleed grid. And again, we have those scale of the close-ups and the full wide shots on each of these rows. And as you move through, the layout's moving around and we have all these principles employed, but the sequence is telling a story. And by being consistent with this very simple black and white color scheme, just using one font and, you know, the consistently cropped images and such like that, but it allows you to have that consistency but also interest because the layout's moving around. Now we've got overlaid images, which is a new element. You know, we've got different color backgrounds as we go through, and they each look strong as they could almost be posters, each individual panel, but they also sequence in this really interesting way because it continues to move around and keeps the reader engaged with the page. Let's have a look at something with maybe a little bit more of a smaller budget. This site, Stand With Ukraine. And this is about sharing information from the war. And we have these principles here, grouping. Obviously, we've got a top menu. Then we have sort of a navigation through the site here across the middle. and the sort of information on, you know, the time at the moment in Kyiv and how many days the war has been going on and such like that. But these other elements of scale and sequence are particularly done well on this site. So as we scroll through, we see these images, you know, come into view. But underneath, as I move these speech bubbles out of the way, we see a large quotation in the background. So there's a definite difference in point sizes here. And again, they're using sort of larger paragraphs next to smaller captions. And then we have this huge date in the background, which is bleeding off the page. But as we scroll, the 24th of Feb comes into view. And even the composition with these images moving through, you know, they're off axis, you know, bringing a little bit of interest. Following the rules doesn't mean, you know, boring, boxy layouts. And I think this shows here, but it's an element of sequencing. It feels this storytelling, like these images being thrown down on a table or something. It feels like this thing is developing day by day as we are learning more about the story, exactly what is happening. It's really clever, actually, this site. I recommend you check it out. There's this little, if I can get the menu to appear at the top. Here you can switch over to Russian Truth instead of World Truth, and you can see sort of the alternative narrative that's going on, and these, you know, quotes from Vladimir Putin and this kind of thing, and their images from the scenario. So really interesting site. We'll put a link to that down in the description, but let me encourage you to think about, as you're looking at your own designs and as you're observing other people's designs, to see these principles in action. Number 7 is alignment, and you'll see all these come together at the end, but alignment is arranging items on vertical and horizontal axes. So with body copy, we generally want to align that to the left. That should be your default. That looks the best most of the time. You only have the rag on one side, and it's the most legible. It's the easiest for people to read. Now, you can center align for short sections. That can definitely work. Right alignment, occasionally for compositional reasons, for very short sections. Justified text, wouldn't generally advise it on the web. It can work in print, but you need to be a skilled designer to fix all the rivers and different issues that's created in justified text. So you need to be a good typesetter to do that. So in general, we left align. And with all the other elements, there should just be some element of decision making. Seemingly random alignment looks amateurish. Now, we can have compositional alignment for headlines, so everything doesn't have to be, you know, barrel straight down the left or centrally. You know, headlines that seem to be like off axis on different lines or different angles and things can definitely work if it, you know, fits with these other principles. But I'll show you some bad examples later, as well as some good ones, and hopefully that'll help bring it all together. Let's have a look at a website where this is done well. And this is for Grilly Type, who are a type foundry. And this is their kiosk where they sell little bits of merch. And although this is a very simple website, shall we accept cookies? Seeing as it's a type foundry, we will. The alignment is very deliberate. So at the top where we have the name, Grilly Kiosk, and then shopping bag on the right, there is this rule horizontally, which helps you know that this shopping bag doesn't just float around in space, but it helps emphasize the deliberate alignment. It's aligned to the right, and it's also horizontally aligned along this same line. These navigation to these different items are aligned to the left. All the information here, the headline of the product, the price, the description, etc., is left aligned. This button is the full width of the column in this case to emphasize that the layout in columns. And you can even see with them being a type foundry, hopefully they employ these principles, but even within this actual document, you can see these rules that are emphasizing the rows. And the alignment is very deliberate here, even throughout this document. Obviously, you know, with it being a type specimen, they've, you know, kind of used all of the space and that kind of thing, but they're still very deliberate. Some of the principles we talked about last time, like scale and sequence on display here, we see again in this type library. The rules, everything aligned in a very consistent manner. It looks very deliberate. Even when you go down to the footer, the information below the line in the footer is on the same columns as these products here, and it makes it feel very consistent and deliberate. And it can be a challenge on the web with alignment because you have different screen sizes and such, and you need to create responsive layouts, but each screen size should be catered for and checked carefully to ensure that the alignment looks right in all these different places. The next principle, number 8, is balance. How do you make things feel balanced? Well, for a lot of people, they do it by symmetry. Symmetry is often employed because it's the easiest way of achieving balance. And center alignment, which we talked about being suitable for certain formats, short sections of text, but symmetry is kind of a lazy, not very interesting way of achieving balance. And again, with text, it doesn't look the best. It's not the best solution for longer ranges of text. So asymmetrical layouts, which is the one below, these are more flexible and they often look more elegant. So you simply need to use counterbalancing elements to distribute the visual weight. So in this example of this magazine, this composition of this photo essay is more visually interesting than a symmetrical one because, or one with all the images the same size, because it's been arranged deliberately to achieve a balance. So the model on the right hand page is looking into the layout and is placed slightly to the right of center within the frame. Her gaze is in the direction of the top image on the left page, and then the bottom left image is there to balance the composition across the spread by adding weight into this area. And this layout was created using our final principle, number 9, grids. Command of the grid allows you to achieve all of the above. It's the most useful tool for the designer who wishes to produce an effective layout. The structure, it creates order, it conveys confidence in your work. I grabbed another magazine from here in the studio, took a quick snap of it, and you can see here this grid layout perhaps on display. So on the right we have a full page image, and on the left page we have the type. But if I've overlaid, roughly, this is an image with the pages folded, but you can see there's a 7-column grid. So each of the columns of type actually span over 3 columns, 3 and 3, and then the one in the center, there's a little box out caption which has then been center aligned. So there's a combination of different alignment going on here as well. We have kind of a center alignment really because at the top where it says Big Interviews Global, the section of the magazine, and then below that the headline of the article and the byline, and then that caption I mentioned. So they all align on that central axis, and then the columns at either side are justified. So, but we have the balance between the two because it's heavy with type, and then this full page image on the other side. So these principles of alignment and balance and grids are here. As you cycle through a later page in this same magazine, you see the same grid, the 7-column grid. And again, I've done this roughly. There's probably gutters within these columns. That's the space between each actual column. You'll see that if you set up your columns in something like Adobe InDesign for print or Figma or XD for the web, you'll have that option of the gutter, the little space in between. Check out Rand's video on Figma that he produced recently if you want to look at how you set up those columns and lay out a website. But here, what they've done is the type columns are actually left aligned with a rag, and then they are 2 columns wide instead of 3 as in on the lead page for the article. So they've got 3 columns of type here. And you can see how images are across 2 or 3 columns on the left page, and they might span all 7 like the one on the bottom left. So with a grid, you have a lot of options to play with in your layout to give interest. In the last video, part 2, we talked about sequencing. A layout that moves around as you cycle through gives some interest, or you scroll down. Similarly with the example we showed last time of this coffee table book. So with a print or some sort of fixed layout like a PDF or something, it allows the designer to set margins and rows as well as columns in a standardized manner. And that's difficult to achieve sometimes in responsive design, although we saw with the Grilly type example, making sure we take care of that horizontal alignment as well can produce a really pleasing result. So every module in a grid doesn't need to be filled. It's usually preferable to leave some empty. We saw that in the magazine, and we see that in this book example. Another book I grabbed from the studio. This is a book on the architect Zaha Hadid. You can see just having some white space allows you to achieve, a balanced feel, even if it's asymmetrical. I mean, this layout is symmetrical in this instance, but if you see another spread from this same book, this time the images bleed out over the margins. So there are different options you can have within the grid, and having the grid in position allows you to then make use of all the principles we've talked about. Using a grid does not make a good design. It's a tool to help you achieve a suitable result, and tools are brilliant. Tools what we use, a musical instrument is a tool to make something that sounds beautiful. A screwdriver is a tool for fixing screws. You get the idea. So bearing in mind all the principles, all 9 principles that we've talked about, use your grid to achieve these things, to find that suitable focal point, allow white space around it, group things together along that grid layout. It really helps with alignment and achieving balance and those kind of things. But you need to bear all these things in mind. You can't just plonk things into different cells and think, hooray, I've achieved a great layout. Still need to choose, make decisions about where the focal point is and things like that. So let's have a look at a poor layout. Often we see these things and think, yeah, but what about when it's not working? What does that actually look like? Well, it's hard to find these things. I had to do a bit of a Google, and I found this one for a student Christmas party. And where to begin with this? Let's see what you can spot. But let's move through these 9 principles. I mean, where is the focal point? I have no idea. White space, there's none of it. It's like, let's cram more stuff into every little area. Hierarchy, I have no idea what's most important, what really stands out. I kind of see Walkabout in the middle, which is like a pub, a club venue. I see Santa, I see Christmas. I have no idea. Grouping. This would really benefit from grouping. Remember our nightclub poster from before, I think it might have been a previous video. We grouped together some of the information, the when and where, the ticketing information. This could be pulled together in different sections to help it. Scale. This is a big problem. There's not enough of a difference between the point sizes. Now I'm looking at it, I'm seeing all these other issues like kerning. Look at the word party, just what's going on with that P and the A. But the point sizes, the scale, so the scale of the imagery, which is, is it in the background, is it in the foreground, the logo and all the different type, it's too similar. There's not enough of a dramatic difference in scale to make more of a pleasing composition. Sequencing is not really relevant because it's a poster. Alignment, what is this aligned to? I have no idea. It was kind of a compositional alignment with the headline, but then it's all over the shop, isn't it? Balance, no, just fill all the spaces. Grids have definitely not been used. So it takes a designer to, really pull this apart and make sense of this and think about what this poster is trying to achieve and trying to do. I mean, you look at really elegant design posters like the Swisted project from Mike Joyce, who's the owner of Stereotype Design in New York City. And I know you're probably thinking, okay, yeah, but this is for, fans of music and design, kind of obnoxious design fans who look down on the sort of gaudy, gauche designs of the previous mess. Yes, but these principles are in play, and you could do something that was maybe looked more engaging and fun for students who wanted a good night out, while still applying these principles. These posters have a clear focal point. They make good use of white space, hierarchy, grouping. Scale is dramatically employed here. The large graphic elements, and remember last time we talked about the large, medium and small elements. That's what we have on each of these posters. And obviously he's used a grid to help lay things out, and achieving balance throughout these designs. So this is kind of a best practice example of how you do that. But what about something like, a poster's one thing. How do you do that through a website and bring all these things together? Well, I think some of the examples we've talked about in previous weeks display that, but let's have a look at another one right now. Let's go to another website away from this Grillitype website, over to the website for the recent movie. Let's just refresh it. House of Gucci. This was kind of a mini site to help promote this film, and we have that dramatic sense of scale with this large headline, and it's very large. It fills the page, but as we move through, every panel has these principles in mind. It tends to be center aligned, which works in this sense, but we have this sense of sequence, like if we hover over something, other images come through, and each panel, so each section of the website becomes its own little area, and we get the sense of that by each one having a panel as we go through. So if we click on one of these, costume design, there's lovely use of white space here to really let this headline stand out. It's very clear. We know what it is. It's this person, I guess the person in charge of costume design for the film, talking about it. Here she is. She's done a phenomenal job. And the sense of scale, the different sizes, point sizes as we move through, not too many, but just varying it from the headlines to the captions to the body copy from the interview. Obviously, they've got phenomenal photography and such, but it's laid out. Again, we can see a grid. You can see here the structure, the gutters here between the rows and columns, and these nice box outs. And this is sequence as we move through. And again, you don't need to fill every cell in a grid. Leave some empty. This creates white space, asymmetrical layout. So watch how it balances. This one was on the left, the space here. Then this image is on the right. And it all works to really tell a story and give a really pleasing experience for the viewer, because there's enough white space that it feels calm enough for me to navigate through, to spend some time reading this interview. So when you can bring all these elements together, that's when you can do things that are really interesting and will just bring a bit of joy to your viewer and your user as they move through your sites. Here in Figma, I'm going to give you a beginner's introduction to grids in digital design. Then we're going to jump into some more complicated editorial design style grids. So you can follow along here in Figma if you'd like to. I'm just going to make a new frame for a desktop size frame. And here we can set up some grids. So you can see here in the right column we have layout grid. So if we click add, it adds a grid in here, and this is a simple modular grid. It's like a baseline grid of 10 pixels. So it's creating all these 10 pixel squares, and this kind of thing can be quite useful for things like apps, or when you're designing even a website icon design, having some sort of baseline for the size of things. So you might have like a line, a rule as we call it in graphic design, that's always going to be, maybe 10 pixels high, and we maybe use multiples of that. So 200 wide, 10 high, for example, for this shape. Or let's just add a fill to that so we can see it. That's not white. And then you might, say, okay, but my buttons, they're going to be a different height. They're going to be like 30 pixels high or something like this. So if we zoom out, and you could develop things along this sort of baseline. But to give us something a little bit more useful, we also, when it comes to something like web design and getting going as a beginner, if you click on grid here, you can see there's different types of grids. We can also have a column grid, and you can choose here, the count means the number of columns. So let's type in 12 columns. You can change the color here if you want to have a different color for the guidelines for the columns and how opaque or that is. We can make it a little bit darker. And the type, so this is stretching them across with a gutter, a space in between each column, the white space here of 20 pixels. So we can change this however we want. We can center it, so then now it's not stretching them, it's giving it an absolute size. So that here it's 10 pixels. If we change that to 100, you can see how they would stretch across the page like that, and we have a little bit of margin auto-generated at each size. Now 12 I selected is a common number for columns, and the reason is that when you're creating something with 12 columns, you can have lots of different multiples. 12 has lots of factors. So here we have got 1 across, so we can we can do this as 12. I'm just using the command D to duplicate, to repeat the action. So here we've got, if we just turn this grid off, which is Shift G, 12 items that are 1 column wide each. Then we would maybe do something where we had 2 columns. If I can do this exactly. So we've got 6 items that are 2 columns each. Then we could have 3 column wide for 4 items. We could have 4 column wide for 3 items, and we could have 6 column wide for 2 items, and we could have 12 column wide for 1 item. I've not quite done that exactly. There we go. And also obviously you could go across the whole size of your frame as well, beyond the margins. So there are lots of different options here because of all these different multiples that allow you to create things within this grid. So when it comes down to creating something more useful, you know, we might, for example, have a little square like this. It's not quite a square, is it? Let's make it square. And then maybe have something that spanned over a couple of columns next to it. You know, it might be some type, might be some points in a list, something like that. So there's better ways to do these layouts, but we're just demonstrating the grids. So you can see you begin to, you know, create different little things like this. That different options. You might have an image, for example, that spans over more columns, you know, to halfway. Then some text to the side of it, you know, using the columns even as spaces in between. You know, we could do something that was a couple of rows of text, a few rows of text, go over a couple of columns. So you can start to create these different kind of things in digital design. So that's just to illustrate the idea of a 12 column grid, setting that up in Figma, how you can use that to make sure that things are aligned properly. But I really want to get into the meat of this video now, showing you how to set up modular grids and then lay out your elements. So for that, we're going to jump over to Adobe InDesign. So once you're in InDesign, go to File, New Document. We're going to set the intent as print. Number of pages, let's do 7 to give us some to work with. Facing pages, which is going to turn these into spreads. The page size is A4 and the orientation as portrait. We'll start with 1 column and set them up in a moment. The margins, again, leave those as 0 or set them to 0, and we'll set them in a moment. The bleed, I'm going to make that 3 mil just for good practice. That's what we should normally do in print, but it's not really necessary for a demo. And then click OK. Then I want you to select the parent. Now the parent is the template for those unfamiliar with InDesign. So if we draw a box here, which is cyan, then that's going to appear, as you can see in these thumbnails here, on all the different pages. Okay, let's delete that thing. Now make sure you've got both selected here. You can just click on them, hold shift, click on them. And then we're going to go to layout, margins and columns. So we're going to set our margins now. So a top margin, I'm going to select as 10 mil, just to make this nice and easy. And you can see here it appears at the top of our pages. Now the bottom layout, I could set this as 10 mil, but when you have your top and bottom margins the same, it gives the effect of the layout falling off the page. And all margins, if I click this, make all the same, being the same size, it looks very default, and we want to add some life into this composition. So best practice over hundreds of years of typesetting tells us that we want to change these things. So we're going to change the bottom margin to 20, or double what the top margin is. These aren't exact relationships that you have to use every time, but they'll give you an idea of the principles. The inside margin, I'm going to make at 1.5x, so 15 millimeters, and the outside I'm going to make the same as the top margin. Now you can set the columns here, but I don't want to, so I'm going to just leave that there, and then I'm going to click OK. And you can see the one column grid that we now have and how it sits on the page. If we draw like a black box, just to really emphasize how this looks, I'll put that onto both sides. I'm just going to hold Option while I click and drag that over. I press W to switch to preview view, and you can see how the area within the margin sits on the page. It's just a little bit more interesting and dynamic than all the margins being the same. So now let's set up some columns. In fact, let's save this thing, and I encourage you to do the same thing. We're going to go to Layout, Create Guides. So I want to do my columns first, and I'm going to select 5 columns on each page, and the gutter, which is this space in between, the smaller space. So you can say if I change that to something huge, you see it becomes where we can't even recognize the columns, or something very small. But I'm going to change that to 10, which is the same as my outside margins, my outside and top, because I want to just have that feel of them being the same between the images and such. And then the rows, I'm going to do 6 rows. Now the gutter here, it doesn't have to be the same as the column gutter, just as it didn't have to be the same as the outer margin size. You can do whatever you like with this. It depends on the requirements of your layout. But as we're learning here how to set these things up, I'm going to put them all the same as 10 and have that nice consistent margin around items here. Now make sure you fit your guides to the margins that you've set. In this instance, if you want to follow along, if we do it to page, you see how they move around? Margins, page, that's going to start at the very corner of the page. So within our area inside the margin, this first cell is going to be a different size to the next one. So make sure that's to margins. And the reason I created the guides in here and not in the margins dialog box is because I have this option here of removing existing ruler guides, and it's easier to, I find, to edit via here. So I'm going to click OK, and that is our basic grid set up. Now I promised you a combined grid, so I'm going to go Layout, Create Guides again and just do some simple things. I'm going to select 2 columns with 0 gutter, and that is going to give us a center line. I can see if we just turn the preview on and off, on, and again align to the margin. If we do that to the page, that's going to be off to the center versus where our main grid is, and it's difficult to see here where is the cell, the gutter. So make sure that's to the margins, and we know we've got a center line on each page, which I often find useful. And one more thing, I'm going to add another guideline at the bottom to align my page number to. Now, you don't have to do it this way again, but go up to the ruler here, click and drag, and you can just drag guidelines down. Now, I want this the same 10 mil from the bottom, so that's 297, which is the A4 size. So I'm going to do it at 287. Did that move? It'll tell me up here. It's always hard with a stylus when you let go. 287 on both sides. So if I do want that same margin at the top and bottom, just where I sit my page numbers, I have that option. So let's do that now. I'm going to select the type tool. I'm going to click and drag a type area into here and just type in a default page number, even number on the left. So I've typed 28. I'm going to align this to the bottom and range it to the left when you type selected. Now, it doesn't really matter what font you use. Something similar, you know, around 10 point, 9 point, something like that is fine for now for the purposes of this demo. I'm going to drag a copy box over here and I'm going to range this type to the right. This isn't really an InDesign demo, it's a grids demo, but I will mention a few things about InDesign because I know some of you will be unfamiliar with it. So that is basically setting up our page numbers, what they would look like. So overall, I'm quite happy now. Now, it does look like we're going to have the feel of the margin being the same all the way around, but because this will just sit in this field, if I draw this box again, it'll be okay because you will still get the feel that the bottom margin is larger, as you can tell here, with the page number being a small element within there. So to make these actual page numbers, what I'm going to do is just delete this or select it and go to type, insert special character, markers, current page number. And you can also see there is a shortcut for that, which is Option Shift Command N on the Mac. And that's put it as A, because you see this is a parent. I'll do it here with the shortcut. AA, but if we go down to 4 and 5, you can see there, 6 and 7, and I'm just double clicking on these previews, our page numbers are in there. Fantastic. Now what we want to do is bring in some content and make this a little bit more interesting. So if we select page 2 and 3, what I like to do with content is add this in to the side and have it close by so that I can know what I'm working with and the elements that I have to hand. So I've prepared a little bit of copy and a few images. So here's a headline. This is for our magazine spread. So I'm just going to put a text box here. Let's just bring a couple of 3 text boxes. And if you want to type this out, you can. It's very short. I don't need to send you this. This is just something made up to allow us to do this layout. Okay, so we've got this type, and then we'll have some imagery which I'd maybe pull in, but I've just gathered a few photographs that we're able to use. So when I have the content and some idea of what we're working with, maybe this is going to stay small, so maybe let's just make these a little bit bigger just so we can get the sense of the hierarchy, that this is going to be the headline. These are the droids you're looking for. And then this is going to be like a byline. And then we've got the credits for the writer and the photographs for the article. And then we'll probably add, you know, some body copy with some placeholder text. So once I have that there, I like to think about layouts and different options. Now for this, I tend to jump over onto a sketch pad with a pencil and paper. Now here I've got a gridded pad and I've drawn a bunch of layouts, just different options that might work for this. Now I've got the grid in mind. I know I'm using this 5-column grid. So because I have some experience of grid layouts. I know kind of how it's going to feel, how it's going to work together, but I thought about, what if it was a 4-column grid or a 6-column or a 5-column grid, and just done a few ideas. This is always something I can change if you're setting up a new grid for a new project. But it's just to think about some different compositions. Now, even if you're not familiar with grids and you're not really sure where to start, it is just good to start to do some layouts based on the things you know, the things that are important. Well, what about the hierarchy? The headline needs to be quite big, or maybe some imagery, maybe that's going to be the largest thing. And in most cases here, I've got the imagery is the largest, most dominant element, then the headline, and then everything else becomes the tertiary elements. So I'm going to look at these sketches and now do a few different layouts based on these sketches, maybe with some boxes, maybe bringing in some of the content, and see how we can actually set these items out across our grid. I've decided to speed up this section and add the commentary later because it was a bit slow in real time, but other than that, there are no other edits, there are no cuts here. This is my first attempt at laying out elements in this grid. So here you can see I'm doing some typesetting with a large headline, subheadline underneath, and the grid is really useful at just giving you a place for things to belong, things to align to. Again, based on sketches, I'm just looking back and forth here to my sketchpad and seeing which layouts I want to try out. You can see here the larger margin at the bottom and the feel that that gives on the page, and just trying different things to achieve balance, to achieve a nice composition within each layout. Now I'm trying actually spreading over the fold in the middle, which is a nice technique of the photograph going through the fold. And again, the grid just gives you a nice place to align to, making sure there's that gutter around the type so it's still clearly legible. Trying a bit of a different layout here with another image, and this is again based on a sketch. I've got one where there is a large headline of just one word that I've decided to span across the full width between the margins. So I'm just drawing that out here in InDesign, made that into curves so I could just bring it to the exact size. And then this idea of an image within the grid that is overlaid with the headline. And it just shows you how quickly you can achieve different layouts when you have a grid, because it's suggesting things to you, and based on the sketches that you've already got, it's very quick to begin to pull things together and make sure that things are in alignment and achieve the right sort of feel that you want and the balance that you want on a page. I thought now about maybe the next page in the article after the opening pages with the title, you'd maybe have some sort of photo spread, have some more copy, and want to introduce some more images. So I'm just laying them out here, and you can see I've got a column with 3 rows of images and then the column next to it with 2, and this just adds a little bit more interest. I'll just create an example here where as if we had 3 and 3, it's a little bit static looking, and it just adds more interest with what we have on the right. And that's the great thing about grids. They suggest this kind of thing to you, and it's very easy and quick to set these things up, having the correct margins around everything and suggesting this. So now to achieve balance across this spread, because the images on the right are way over to the right and I'm not using the left column on the right hand page, I've decided to have this image which spreads right off the page on the left. And so even though that it's smaller than the others, it distributes the visual weight by pulling something over to the left. So it's distributed across the spread. And here I've got the columns of text that run down. And this was all done in about 18 minutes. Like I said, first attempt at doing these spreads. And this is not finessed. If this was going to be a final magazine, I definitely want to add some more detail, maybe some little titles for each section. But it shows you how quickly, in just 18 minutes, you can lay out a few spreads and you can begin to get a feel of how something will work within a grid, and we can add some interest later. Next up, you're going to learn how to speak like a professional designer. But as you've already watched a solid hour just on layout, I can tell you're serious about improving your graphic design skills. Check out our Core Design Skills program, where I not only teach the fundamentals of design in a systematic way, you'll also have the opportunity to complete assignments and receive expert personalized feedback on your work from our mentors at Flux Academy. Adding practice and feedback to your knowledge of the principles is how you really get better. There's a link in the description, so have a look and see if it's right for you. Typography is the art of arranging type to make the written word readable and visually appealing. You need knowledge of typesetting, type design, and typefaces. Typesetting is the process of laying out text on a page. To do this well, pay attention to the point size, ensuring it is large enough to be legible, but not too large. You're looking to achieve an ideal line length because too many words on a line puts the reader's head on a swivel. Leading, known as line height to web designers, is the vertical space between each line of text. Tracking, the overall letter spacing, how far apart each character is from one another. And kerning is adjusting the space between a pair of characters or glyphs. You don't need to be able to design your own font to be a designer, but some knowledge of type design is helpful. Know the features of the typeface. Is it a serif font, the kind with small flecks at the end of the strokes, or a sans serif without serif, or a decorative like black letter, script, or hand-drawn type? Dive into type anatomy to help you analyze faces, but you should at least know about ligatures that combine two or more letters into a single glyph, ascenders, descenders, and X height, the height from the baseline of lowercase characters. Speaking of which, what's the difference between a typeface and a font? The overall design of the set is a typeface, for example, Helvetica Neue, but a particular width and weight and emphasis would be a font like Helvetica Neue, bold, condensed, italic. If you'd like to dive more into choosing fonts, I've got a video called How to Choose Fonts, which we'll link to in the description. Secondly, colour. Understanding colour theory is crucial to creating captivating designs that stir emotion and deliver your intended message. You should ensure that you're working in the correct colour mode, CMYK for print and RGB for digital, and be familiar with HSB, hue, saturation and brightness. Think of hue as how we would name the colour, like green, orange, lilac, etc. Saturation, how intense it is. If you decrease saturation, you add white, these are tints. And brightness, how light it is. If you decrease brightness, you add black, these are shades. To go further, create your own palettes by learning about the relationships on the colour wheel, like monochromatic, complementary, analogous, etc. And the interaction of colour. The perceptual effect of the interplay of different colours when they are placed together in a composition. Josef Alber's book is the Bible on this. If you want to take the next step, I also have a video on how to choose colours. Composition, how elements are arranged in a layout. Dragging things around at random is not the best approach. Adhering to design principles will produce a better result more quickly. At design school, they teach you the Gestalt principles of visual perception, originated in Germany in the early 20th century. Ideas like proximity, similarity, closure, continuation, but as a beginner, focus on hierarchy, prioritizing elements based on their importance to guide the viewer's attention. If you want to understand 9 principles of layout, focal point, white space, hierarchy, grouping, scale, sequence, alignment, balance, and grids, and see examples of each, I've got a 3-part video series on that too, because they are terms you should definitely know. The fourth area is image editing. As designers, we often work with images to enhance our layouts. These could be vector graphics, which are made of paths based on mathematical equations so that they can be scaled infinitely without loss of quality. Or they could be raster images, also known as bitmap, made up of pixels, like digital photographs, for example. Their resolution, the number of pixels per unit area, affects image quality and file size, so ensure you're working at the correct resolution for your use case. Editing can involve adjusting the appearance of an image, like color balance and contrast, retouching, stacking elements in layers and cropping, removing the unwanted parts to create the most pleasing composition. If you want to go further, have a look at my free crash courses in Photoshop and Illustrator. Web. Now, being a good web designer requires knowledge of how the web works. You don't need to become a web developer, but
but you do need to know how to communicate with web developers, good luck with that, and have an awareness of what's possible on the web. Responsive design, designing websites to adapt seamlessly to various screen sizes and devices, has been mandatory for years now. The digital design process usually involves preceding high-fidelity visuals with wireframes, basic sketches which outline layout and structure. There's lots of acronyms in the world of web like UI, user interface, UX, user experience, CTA, call to action, a prominent element like a button which encourages the user to do something specific, and CSS, cascading style sheets, and get it right, the code that's responsible for the layout and styling of much of the web. If you want to learn web design, we have a free web design course playlist here on the channel. Our penultimate area is print. Now hold up if you're a digital designer, print remains an integral part of communications, and at some point you're going to need to print something and communicate with a vendor or print designer. At the very least, be aware of trim lines where the media is going to be cut, safe area, keeping key elements like text away from the edges so they don't get lost, and bleed, allowing your artwork to extend beyond the trim area to prevent small white borders showing through at the edges due to the slight irregularities that occur when the paper is chopped. After all this, you might end up with PMS, the Pantone Matching System, which is a standardized color library ensuring accurate reproduction. They produce these books, as well as fabric swatches for fashion and all kinds of other stuff. It's the industry standard. And if you're a graphic designer, then get familiar with different printing methods too, so at the very least, you know what's possible for your clients. Graphic design movements and styles. In any field, you need to know some history and keep abreast of trends. This is true if you're a fan of a sport, a style of music, or whatever industry you work in. It's very difficult to communicate with others without this knowledge, like being a basketball fan today but never having heard of Michael Jordan. So this is going to be a very quick tour, but here are some influential movements every designer should be aware of. Art Nouveau, an artistic style from the turn of the 20th century characterized by organic forms and ornamental motifs inspired by nature. Bauhaus, originating from a German art school between the world wars, Bauhaus embraced simplicity, functionality, and geometric design. Swiss modernism followed in the post-war era, trying to bring order after the chaos. Its apologists advocated for the clean, grid-based typographic layouts which went on to dominate corporate communication for decades. Postmodernist graphic design was part of the wider philosophical and cultural movement known as postmodernism. In the latter part of the 20th century, it found prominence and was marked by eclecticism and irony, featuring hand-drawn elements, irregular collages, and a disregard for legibility. At the beginning of this millennium, skeuomorphism was the thing. Digital interfaces imitated the appearance of real-world objects to provide users with a sense of familiarity. Since then, the web has led to an explosion in trends which move at an ever faster pace, although true movements take longer to develop and become recognizable as such.
Firstly, the first act is before you start. You need to answer these questions. Don't skip this to build a solid brief. Number one, what constraints do I have? There might be brand guidelines. There might be limitations of a format, for example, in print. Then nextly, what guidance do I have? Is there a written brief already? What existing materials and resources do you have to work with? Do they give you any guidance in terms of your color choices? Number three, what do I want the viewer to do? So thinking about the action, thinking about the purpose of this design. And number four, what do I want the viewer to feel? What kind of emotions am I trying to evoke? What moment is the viewer in when they're engaging with this design? So answering those four questions helps you to build a brief and have some parameters by which to choose your colors. So let's jump into the software and I'll demonstrate how we do this. Number one, when you're selecting colors, is to choose a primary hue. Now, what is a hue? I like to think of this as the answer a 2-year-old child would give you if you asked them, what color is this? They wouldn't say sapphire or sienna or mustard. They would stick to basic colors like green, red, blue, yellow, primary colors, secondary colors. And that's what a hue is. It's the general sort of group whereabouts you are on the sort of color spectrum, and you want to choose this based on psychology, based on associations, based on mood. So color psychology is some prior knowledge you'll need as a designer. We have a free ebook on this, which gives you a basic introduction to the subject and lets you know some of the representations. Like red is about passion, danger, love, fire; green, growth, prosperity, health, eco-conscious, sustainability; blue, trust, reliability, power, relaxation, peace. So this will give you kind of an introduction to these ideas, but you want to think as well about associations in different places and different cultures, like political parties, where you are. It could be religions, it could be sports teams. They have a particular association and people feel very strongly about them. So you might be careful what colours you're using in South Central Los Angeles or Belfast, Northern Ireland, or wherever you are. There'll be colours to use and colours to avoid depending on the scenario. So being aware of that when it comes to the design and where this design is going to go is an important thing. But I'm conscious that you can't rely on any one element in design, just type, just color, just your layout, just your imagery to produce the desired effect. It's all things working together. Just using yellow doesn't make something optimistic, red dangerous, purple doesn't necessarily make it regal. Like this example I've got here in Illustrator. The royal family, to come across as regal, as royal, they may use purple, but everything has to work together, all the elements, else it's not going to produce the desired effect. So color is one piece of this. So you should have made good progress at this point with this idea of choosing a primary hue before you've even touched any software. You're thinking about the psychology, avoiding any negative associations or joining with positive ones, the mood that you want to bring. Is it going to be a cool color like blue? Is it going to be a warmer color like yellow, orange, red? And that should help you think about primarily where you want to go with this. And then you want to choose that hue and then move into selecting a particular color logically. So I'm going to demonstrate that for you. So here in Illustrator, I've got set up these two clothing brands, and these are both eco-conscious, sustainable clothing brands that produce their clothing in an environmentally sustainable way, and that is a key part of their offer and their proposition. So when it comes to selecting a primary hue and then choosing a particular color logically, I like to use the HSB sliders, which you can see here, and this stands for hue, saturation, and brightness. So you can see how these work. You turn on the saturation, it gets paler. What we're doing there is adding white, which is making a tint. We turn down the brightness, we're adding black, which is making a shade. And so I like to select a primary hue. So do we want red or orange or yellow or green or blue or purple or pink for this brand? Well, we talked about them being a green. We use that as a description in English. If something's green, it's environmentally friendly, sustainable. So we're going to go for somewhere around like a mid sort of green type color for this brand. So then you would apply this and kind of see what it looks like. So this is our primary color. I'll make it the type for HIP and the background for this clothing collective. HIP is a youthful, young, edgy brand for teenagers and people in their early 20s. Clothing Collective is a more mature brand for people who are maybe in their 40s. So here we can see straight away that we have got this very saturated and bright green. And for this HIP brand, it kind of works already. It's got this like very youthful feel to it. So I'm happy with that. Clothing Collective, not so much. It doesn't jive with this word mark and what we've talked about in terms of the target audience. So we would probably want to dial down the saturation so it wasn't so heavy, probably quite a lot. And then also with this being a background, this is kind of like a mint color now. I don't really want that. I want a calmer sort of feel. So I'm going to take the brightness down a little bit too. Then it's getting a little bit dark now because I've added black. So I'm going to have to take the saturation down even further for it to function effectively as a nice sort of background color. Maybe the brightness can come up a little bit. So this is more the kind of feel that I'm going for. So for the foreground, which is still black, I'm going to select this background. So I'm starting from the same place, and then just bring the brightness down, and I've got something which contrasts. You might get to the point where it gets a bit too black and you want to bring that saturation up a little bit, so there's a little bit of green in there. But I think this is just kind of off green thing, so that kind of works for me. I'd maybe go even less saturated perhaps, but we're getting to that kind of idea, and this to me works. This gives the right kind of feel that we're looking for. It's more subtle with the green thing, but they both have that green aspect. But that's proceeding logically, selecting particular colors, because we're thinking about the contrast here between foreground and background. We're thinking about what the effect of the saturation and the brightness produces a mood. So we're not just saying green, therefore we've done the job because it's eco-conscious, because this obviously, next to this type, it looks ugly. But with this kind of typesetting on HIP, it works. So it's all about the context, and that's how I sort of proceed through using these HSB sliders to find the colors that I want. The third of 4 steps is to then build a palette. So you want to think now about how many colors that you are going to need. So how many colors should you use in a design? Well, you want to think about having options for background and foreground colors. If your type is going to be it may be a certain color. I mean, I tend to recommend using black for type or white on a dark background. I wouldn't diverge much from that. Too much colored up type, that's very saturated, becomes difficult to read. So just be conscious of that. But we'd maybe need something else, like I don't know, if we've got a button or something like that, we might want a color for that. So let's pretend this is a button. We'll just make it look sort of buttonish with this pill shape. So this could work. We could also maybe want another option for a different kind of button, or to stand out a little bit more. So we might be again pushing our saturation back up, maybe a little bit of brightness just so it comes through, and maybe just finding something that's going to really draw the eye and bring us towards it. So thinking about where you're at and the kind of design that you're doing, you can establish sort of maybe some more colors, some more options for a palette, and I'll show you another option in a moment with some more and how we sort of build that palette out. But I recommend that you use the fewest amount of colors necessary. So if you can only use a few colors, that is better, because there's less chance of mistakes, and the more elements you bring into any kind of design, the more likelihood there's going to be mistakes or things aren't going to work well together. So it requires some skill to sort of build out and use more and more different elements of different kinds. So first of all, you can start out with like one color plus black and white. So this is a very effective technique. You see it a lot with things like books. So like this kind of color scheme, I should say, like just like a red with black and white on this cover. Got another one here. And this is kind of a common thing that you see it with things like signage, but it also works. And there's certain combinations like red and black and white, or yellow with black and white, which really works. And there's a lot you can do with it immediately. I've got some examples here on the web as well. This packaging here for Brooklyn Brewery for their Pilsner Lager, this is kind of a mustardy yellow this time, but again with black and white, and that is a very sharp way of doing it. Borussia Dortmund, the German football team, famous for their black and yellow strip, and you see here on their website they've brought that through all the way through. So it's very black and white with using yellow as an accent for headlines or on some of the buttons and captions, and that works really well. Inter Milan, another football team, they've recently rebranded and they've gone for this very bright digital blue, which was brighter than their previous blue, and they're famous for their black and blue stripes. And again, this black and blue and white really works well together, because the white can work over the black or the white or the blue. So they make a big use of that in their interface. Obviously, it's a lot in the photography of people in shirts, but also here, the next match is highlighted in blue. The following ones are on the black background. A lot of the principles here also we talked about in the Principles of Layout series here on the channel. If you haven't seen that, you can see the use of grids here on this website. You can see the use of scale with these large headlines combined with this smaller type. And there's some really clever layout. I really like this website. But that's a really simple color scheme. Just one color plus black and white is a really effective thing that you can do. So what about if you want to now break out from that? Well, let's look at some other types of color schemes. So this is Adobe Color, and there are other similar and free tools that you can find online. This one's quite helpful because it tells us on the left these different color harmony rules in this column. So here we've got monochromatic. Mono means one color, and monochromatic schemes are where we have a single hue. So if we change this color mode from RGB to HSB, we can see all the way across the hue is 245. That might be quite small on your screen. Hope you're not watching this on a phone, you won't be able to see anything. But it's 245 all the way across, but it's the saturation and brightness have changed. So one color, we're using a single hue all the way across, but the variations of that. And that's a very simple thing to do. That's what we were just doing with our example, with our clothing example, where we used those other greens. They were all one hue, and it was a monochromatic scheme to give us some different tints and shades to allow us to have different options within a user interface. So that's a monochromatic scheme, and it's important to learn the language of design. This really helps you as a designer, not only in working with other people like your art director, but also with your own thinking. Once you know the language, it helps you to recognize things, and that deepens your learning. So let's just look at some of these. Some of these I find a bit bizarre, like square. I'm not sure like to get into this and apply this, but something like analogous color schemes, which is colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So like going from purple to blue, or yellow to green, you know, red to orange, etc. This tends to give quite a sort of calming feel. It feels like these colors should belong together, and it's just like a broadening this kind of monochromatic type feel. So it's often easy to do something with this kind of analogous scheme. So I quite like this, and you can bring these in a bit closer. Adobe Color allows you to do this, and you can port these over straight into your Adobe software. You can just copy these hex references into Figma or whatever software you're using, and you can go, you know, sort of wider. It's not really an analogous scheme anymore, you know, very close, just stuff from monochromatic, and sort of broaden that. So you can play around with that. But that's a nice option. I like using analogous schemes, easy to make the colors work together. Another really useful one is complementary, which is where you have colors that are on the exact opposite side of the color wheel. And a lot of popular combinations, you know, Christmassy sort of reds and greens, popular combinations like blues and oranges, or sort of darker blues and yellows. You see these a lot. This kind of looks like IKEA. So you get these sort of feel, and these complementary schemes where you have colors on the opposite side of the wheel, they give more of a vibrant kind of feel to designs. I also like these split complementary schemes where you go opposite, and you don't go to the exact opposite, but either side of that to bring a couple of colors there. Again, you can bring this in a little bit, and that often gives you some really interesting options when you do this. That's kind of ugly, but there in certain places you get some different interesting kind of options there with the split complementary. I quite like using that as well. So play around with this kind of thing, and this will give you some starting points for building palettes. So let's demonstrate how we might do that. So I've got a couple of brands here. One is Coding Junior, which is hands-on coding camps for 8 to 11-year-olds, and then Artificigens. It's a terrible name, isn't it? I just made these up, which harnesses the power of artificial intelligence for your business. And these businesses are both in tech So they have some similar features, but obviously they have a different target market. One is aimed at children and parents. The other one is aimed at business leaders who would have the opportunity to make purchasing decisions about the partners and the tools that they use. So because they share similar features, you can pick up you might choose some similar things. So if we went through our process, so first of all, we're going to choose a primary hue. So I'm just going to turn the brightness up. So this is off black and saturation so we can actually see the color. Throw it around the middle somewhere. So I'm going to say blue because I'm going to think that trust is going to be a key element with both of these things, because you want parents to trust that if children are going to a camp, that it's going to be a safe environment and it's going to be good quality education. And similarly with businesses, purchasing and sharing their information with AI computers, they want to be able to trust that. So this is going to be a key element. So we might want some kind of blue. And then, so going on from that would be next to, let me just saturate this a little bit more. So maybe say here, like it's nice to go maybe more towards this cyan. It just gives a little bit more of a nice difference to it, a friendliness to it, rather than it being too much of like a royal blue. So I would go for something like this. And then I would think about this kind of scheme that I want to use. So let's look at this Coding Junior first of all, and maybe bring a couple of, do you know what I'm going to do is just snap these things to make it a little bit easier. So we talked about these color schemes. So I'm just going to copy maybe like a reference here, hex reference, see if I can bring this into Adobe Color. Where's our primary one? Here. Okay, so this is our primary one here, and I like this split complementary thing because it gives vibrancy like complementary does, but I'm not sure about these kind of dark orange, dark mustard kind of colors. It doesn't have the vibrancy that I want. So I'm maybe going to split complementary so I can get more of a yellow in there. And it gives me some more options as well, because I've got this orange as well in there in the mix. So let's kind of see what we've got. So I've maybe just dial this, and this is where your eye and your taste as a designer comes into this. There's always going to be that element to it, however many lessons that we teach. I think somewhere around here is pretty cool. So we've created quite an interesting scheme here. It's also given us these shades for this yellow and this orange. So I'll maybe just copy in the hex references. It's probably as easy as anything for this quick demo. So I've got this yellowish one, and then I've got this orange type one. And what you want to do is finesse this. So obviously we're doing this for the purposes of a demo, and we're doing this quickly, but I kind of like this. It has that sense of like warmth, optimism, but also, with the vibrancy, across these colors. So I think there's definitely something in this, but you'll start to finesse this once you bring this into your actual usage of where you're going to, create this on a website or whatever your scenario is. I think maybe as a background color, I quite like this. So I definitely think there's something to this general vibe. Maybe black. So I may be thinking, is this going to be bright enough across this? So it's having some options. We probably wouldn't use this as a headline. Maybe the orange, we'd keep that in a darker color. So we'd maybe like this, but we'd maybe want to create some shades and some tints from this. So maybe actually we turn up the brightness, turn down the saturation a little bit, and get kind of a color that'll work better for, a button. Let me just try this. It's going to contrast a little bit more from a black. And so it's playing around with this kind of thing. Maybe we want an off black kind of color that is going to work. That's going to give us some nice options for titling that don't look too black. That's maybe even still too bright. So it's playing around and it's using it in context. So if you've got some illustrations, you've got wider parts of your interface, it's just playing with that and having fun with that to make that work. Now, we talked about this other brand having some similar characteristics. So what I want to do here is I'd maybe start from the same place and say, okay, these colors again for this brand, but we need to make sure when we're building a palette we have the right feel and we match these things together. So what wouldn't work is when you have things, these are all pretty high on the saturation and brightness, is when you have things that just don't match up in the sort of tone. They look odd and they start to look strange. Like if we just bring these down, because this is where I think this needs to go. It needs to probably be a little bit less saturated, and this is probably more slipped there, the feel that we want. And it is a case of going back and forth on these things. And you need colors with a similar tone. So tone is like tint and shade together. It's like adding gray. So the blacks and whites just kind of looking like they're in the same place. So you can see here now I've messed with this. If we do like an RGB red and green, they don't match with this blue and this kind of goldy beige color here. They just do not fit together. So we need these things to all match up. Now we could make a green work in this scenario, but we'd want to look at, what's this, like 57. Let's start with that and sort of match these up, and straight away that feels like it's coming in and it's going to match a little bit better, and maybe desaturate it a little bit so it's not competing as much with this blue. And it's playing around with these things. And when you've got people watching you on video, it always seems to be more difficult and slower. But this should give you the sort of idea. I'd probably go back to these original colors, maybe the orange, and again bring it more where it's in that similar sort of space, and finding something where the tones match. And this will give you more of the feel that you're wanting and that you're going for. So I think like if this was a larger kind of blue field, then you can imagine more what this thing's going to look like. If this was like an accent, you can see this sort of color, turn this snapping off, is gonna work as a scheme, because you've got a match of similar tones and shades. So we're going a bit less saturated than we are here. So matching those up is really important. If we had, I don't know, maybe this would be part of the design, like all these circles. If we suddenly make these different sizes, if we like make these red, green, it suddenly just looks like really ridiculous. But if these can match up in a similar way, we can get something that sort of feels right. It feels like it's in the right sort of ballpark. I didn't have that selected, and like it belongs together. This is maybe like a a blue that would go next to it. And so it's just taking the time. That one needs finessing, but the idea of taking the time to match things up and having similar shades work together is how you build these sort of color palettes that are going to hang together and make sense. Let's have a look at this in use. Like on the Headspace website, we have a double split complementary color scheme where we've got yellows and oranges across from blues and purples. You could create something like this. Here we go, double split complementary, and we've got like yellow and orange. I need to drag this around. Blues and purples. It's not quite dialing it in here, but you can see sort of like purple across from yellow, blue and orange. And just a point that you do want to finesse these things, and they've finessed that quite nicely, and have various shades of purple and blue and shades of yellow and orange. But what you don't see here are really reds and pinks or greens and browns. We do have a little bit of green in these little illustrations within the app interface, but it's relying more on these key colors, with orange being their key brand color, and they've clearly jumped off from that. You can get into some more crazier schemes. So here we've got this pills where they've got this sort of green on green with purple, and then the peach. And I think the issue here is that it might work in some cases sort of on the bottle, but in the user interface, these colors, there's too much going on. There's too many colors, and it really is just too much noise, and it's not producing sort of a pleasing effect overall. I don't really like this olive green on this color here. I don't even know what to call this. It's sort of a peachy orange. And similarly with this Bioma, I really like the packaging, even though it's a bit pixelated, this image, a bit low res. There's something fun about the packaging. It makes it different. It makes it stand out. It becomes, there's a lot of white within skincare, and it gives you something a little bit different and makes it stand out. But why do we need an interface which is pink and yellow and blue and all this kind of stuff going on? It really crowds it out, and it's just too much. So you don't necessarily, just because you have brand colors, doesn't mean when it comes to your job of selecting colors, mean you need to select those for the website, because it can really be over the top and not allowing the packaging to sing and come through. Again, these things work because the sort of the tones are right, even though some of them, like this hot pink, is kind of a lot more saturated maybe than this mint kind of color, but the sort of the base colors, sort of work together and have this sort of scheme, and there's certain colors that are avoided or not used, and that's enough. But I would encourage them to look at something like Fender guitars. So if we just scroll down a little bit, we can see that the finishes of the guitars are very colorful, but the interface is pretty much just white, black, and then red being the only accent color, other than this kind of grayscale, black, white, and gray. So whether it's something like a headline has a big red background, just the little titles that let us know where we are, or it being the point where you can click special offers, or these bits to start a free trial, or the company's logo, or the button, those key elements being in red just help guide us. It simplifies the interface, even though the colors of the guitars are very vibrant. We have this quiet interface around it, and that allows us to see where we're going. With Cowboy, the electric bikes company, they've similarly simplified this with these colors in the background. Just pick up on the colors in their bikes, or they've picked colors to evoke the right sort of mood. And I feel a lot more calmer on this website, whereas on this site for the skin products, I'm like, I don't feel very calm doing my shopping. It's a bit jarring. Whereas I'm enjoying my experience here on this Cowboy site. It's very Apple-like, the interface, but this use of colors is smart. Just picking up on the color of the bike, making it a little bit darker for this gradient that looks like photo paper in the background. It's just a really smart, neat way of doing it. And again, these tones match from browns to earthy kind of olive greens, and they've just varied the brightness and saturation to get the right sort of tones for the usage, whether they need to be in a background, and make it sort of work together. So I really like that. Something like this site for Sweetgreen, I want to show you lots of examples. People always ask for more examples. This again is just an example of how you can bring tones. Now this is a bit more modern, where there's some bright sort of yellows that do pop out and do look like they maybe don't belong in the palette, and there's a little bit of that youthful anti-design feel that comes through. But overall, similar to what we were doing before, you've got dark green text on a lighter green background, and these colors, the brown and the green, both have that similar tone to help them work together, and this yellowish color, which is still green, so it's within that sort of it's an analogous color palette from sort of yellow across the green and the brown. it pops out, and it's used just minimally. It's a small percentage of each composition, so it works to be a highlight and something that sort of sticks out. So this is a subtle use of color that brings interest to this interface instead of it just being black and white, but it doesn't overwhelm it. This lower saturation look produces more of a calm feel in this scenario. So what they're doing here effectively, and something you'll want to do, is establish some rules for usage. So think about those UI considerations that we talked about, where you're going to use buttons, things being of the right contrast, type being legible, practical things, and simple rules like what's going to be your dominant color, your secondary, your accent colors, really allow it to work. So we've talked in other videos on this channel about the 60-30-10 rule. So 60% of the design being in one color, 30% being in your next secondary color, and 10% for the accents. And a lot of the sites we've looked at today, just thinking back to like Inter Milan, in each of these panels, like here, we've got blue in the background and then the white on top of it. And they've kind of observed this in each panel. Like here, it's mainly black, and then we've got parts of the blue and white with, let me think, what did we look at that was good? I guess similarly with Cowboy, where you've got mainly the background colors are dominant and then white. You definitely see this with Sweet Green, where obviously we've got a photograph here which is dominant, and then your accent is just this yellow, that's your 10%. And similarly here, yeah, we've got this green, the light green in the background is the 60%, the dark green of the type being the 30%, and the yellowish of the accent in the button being that 10% of the color usage. Obviously you've got the image here as well, which, you know, with a similar principle, that's kind of 60% of the space. So it's like a dominant image, and this type is in a smaller area. So this is, you know, a good example of establishing this. So you want to, if you're selecting colors, particularly for a brand, give some idea about usage, because if blue, for example, is your primary brand color, but you've also got a yellow and an orange in there, you don't want people making everything yellow. Yellow t-shirts, yellow packaging, you know, yellow flyers, yellow website, because you want blue to come through primarily. So establishing, no, this is the color we're going to use primarily and how we're going to use it, but don't use it to color up type, and you can use it for a background, or you should use it for buttons. Some sort of use, that's important when it comes to selecting colors. So that might just be for yourself as you're building a website, but that might be also something that you pass on through brand guidelines. The third act is reviewing your work, and this will help give you confidence that you've made the best selection. So first of all, ask yourself, is it functional? So does it work? Do the colors that you've chosen support the information? Do they lead to the desired action? Is everything legible? Is color used consistently throughout the design? Does it guide the viewer? These questions about function. With something like packaging, we think of the ingredients, the colors of the ingredients being used for the packaging, and that's a simple way to guide the viewer to their choice. Maybe used a little bit more subtly on this recent repackaged design for Burt's Crisp, where their brand color of this dark blue is still able to come through on all of their packaging, and their word mark with a big contrast in white type. But this bold all caps type for each of the flavors is colored up, just giving a little cue to the viewer that roast beef is brown, prawn cocktail's pink, chili is red, mature cheddar cheese is yellow, etc. Just helping them make that decision that little bit quicker when browsing for potato chips. Similarly, something like United Sodas, who've made a splash with this very minimalist typographic can design, where each can is just identified by its color. So blueberries are obviously blue, and pear elderflower is green, and we've got cherry red, and we've got blackberry and white grape, etc., strawberry in pink and mango colored. And this has given them a whole brand just based on colors being used in identifying in this very minimal scheme. Interesting here with their user interface, everything down to their packaging, to the actual interface of their website is in black and white. We talked about earlier how these packaging interfaces were maybe crowding out the packaging. Here the packaging is the hero, and this black and white canvas really allows that color to stand out. So I think that's been done quite smartly. Even something like Notion, known for their very black and white look, and just the emojis that kind of stand out in the interface, but their whole brand with these hand-drawn style black and white illustrations. But even here, what color are the buttons? Red. They draw your eye. Try Notion free. They want people, you're not logged in, you're not signed up, they want you to join. So they're promoting that action. Even throughout, because they've got such a simple interface, the little pops of color within the simple website colors, so the interface bits of color stand out. And then things like these logos for brands and companies that actually use their product, you see it a little bit quicker because you maybe recognize the Figma logo, so you just spot that even if you're quickly scrolling past. And it allows it to do that because of simplicity. But red here, the color is supporting the action. And nextly, you want to ask, is it appealing? So color is one of the primary tools that we have as designers to make things look appealing. So something like Stripe, which is, a payment processing, it's not the most exciting thing. Maybe it's quite functional, quite technical, and they've got this almost black and white kind of interface, but they've added this animated gradient at the top, and this color just adds some appeal, adds some interest into something that would look quite flat and uninspiring. It also, again, allows the color logos of the companies to be used and stand out, whereas if you've got a very colorful interface or lots of photography, it's sometimes useful to put those things as gray so they don't compete with everything else. But they have that option this time. Brooklyn Brewery, again, another one from Thirst Agency, and they, for this Pull Part beer, which is a cool name, this hazy IPA, it's described as being juicy and tropical, and you get that kind of feel. This to me evokes summer, and when you see these boxes on the shelf, it's something, the color gives it that appeal. You want to pick it up because not just bright colors, but the colors all work together in a nice way. There's some nice contrasting blue to yellow to give it some vibrancy, and it just, the whole thing works together in this design, including the color, to give it that summery, appealing, fun kind of feel. And make sure you also go through the practical questions like, is it consistent with brand guidelines? If you have those, check them and check them again to make sure your work fulfills that. And have I answered the brief? And this is a great time to ask this question because it will be the basis of your presentation. Whether you're just showing this to your line manager, your boss, or whether it's going to be shown to a client in a presentation, going back to the brief and referring to the key points that were in there, that can be your reasoning, your rationale for why you've selected the colors that you have, and it helps you explain that to your boss or to your client. Step 1 is to write down what you're looking for. Design involves responding to a brief. So let's have a look at some briefs. These from Good Briefs. What I like to do when I see something like this is pick out keywords. So for this, for Authentic Mill, they make luxury cars. So it's about status, nostalgia, old-fashioned. So already that's beginning to convey a mood and give us an idea of the ballpark that we should be in. So what I like to do is write down what I'm looking for, consequently what kind of fonts I'll be looking for. So just start off with things about the mood. Is it going to be playful or serious, restrained or expressive, familiar or strange? Type has both functional and aesthetic qualities. The function is about the legibility, conveying information, communicating something, but also the appearance of the type has its own aesthetic and it's going to evoke a certain emotion and a certain mood, and that's why It's so important to get these things right about selecting fonts, so it can be read where it needs to be read, but it can also communicate more than just the content of the words that are there. But we're seeing something visually. It's not just the same as hearing the words being said. So think about the mood and think about the emotion too, and also then the use. So what is the format going to be? Is this a digital thing, or is it a print thing, or is it going to be both? Does that open other options? In print, we know what the sizes are going to be, so perhaps we have a bigger range of fonts because we can test what that's going to look like on screen. Things are going to be responsive. Perhaps they might appear at different sizes, they'll appear on different devices, so that's going to be a consideration. So maybe make a list as well of what you're going to require. So headline fonts, body copy, captions. This might be obvious, think, well, every website's going to have H1s, H2s, whatever, but it's good to just have a note of that. And I like to have, one piece of paper, maybe just written with a pencil, of the things I need, the kind of mood, the keywords, the emotion I'm trying to evoke, and have that down, and maybe start sketching out some ideas of the kind of headline faces you might want, and some of the layouts. And having that reference as a piece of paper is your beginning. It's that brief for yourself that you can keep at top of mind, and writing down what you're looking for before you just jump into the computer is really helpful. Step 2 is to start with your go-to typefaces. Now, there's been a very popular video on our channel that Ram put together about the only fonts you'll ever need, trash the rest. And when I put this deck together, it's had nearly 250k views, so a lot of people have seen this. And can you really just use 6 fonts? Well, this video was inspired by, and Ram talks about Massimo Vignelli, and in this book, the Vignelli Canon, he talks about, he actually did this exhibition, you can see this when it comes into focus, where he showed off a few basic typefaces, and these classics like Garamond, Bodoni, Century, Futura, Times, Helvetica were the cornerstone of his work. He was one of the most important designers in English language in the 20th century, and you really can do so much with just a certain set of fonts. And sometimes the abundance of choice, it paralyzes us, prevents us from moving forward. But what I find really about having a list of go-to fonts, you might not necessarily trash the rest, but there's going to be a very small percentage of fonts that you use a lot, maybe 80% of the projects, and then rarely you'll bring in other choices. So you need a solid list of go-to fonts that you're familiar with, that you know how to typeset, that you know how to work with. So you might have a set together like this, and I think it's helpful to have them in categories. So different types of fonts. So if you want an old style or a transitional serif, or more of a modern or display fonts, the humanist sans serif. So humanist means it in some way reflects the calligraphic style, with the stroke of a pen. Sometimes you get the thicks and thins and those sort of variants in the strokes. With the transitionals, these became more neutral, and then geometric, we're getting very definite geometric forms, like you can see the points of an uppercase A in Avenir, it's a triangular shape almost, or the lowercase o will be a perfect circle like in Futura. So having certain fonts, and you probably want more than these that here, what's that, like 12, you probably want to build up, so you've got 20, 40, 60 maybe, but you've got some in your head. So if you think, I think this will suit a humanist sans serif, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we get through this video, but having those options in mind and knowing that you have some good options for all of these is really, really helpful, because it just saves so much time. And when it comes to your body copy and setting that means like longer sections of text, It's important to stick to typefaces with classic features and proportions. Your reader will thank you if you do this. If you start using super wide typefaces or very thin or ones with weird features that don't reduce very well at small sizes, it's not going to be legible. It's going to take people longer to read if they can read it at all. And you want people to be able to scan through paragraphs and pick them up very quickly, recognizing the shapes that we're taught to read, from when we begin to learn that. So to be good at selecting fonts, you need to know a lot of fonts, and you have to have your own list of classics. They could be contemporary, they could be older, but they need to be really strong fonts that are your go-tos. And then when you get a brief, like the ones we went through, like this one for luxury cars, nostalgia, old-fashioned, you can think of, and I wouldn't necessarily tick them off, but I just look at this list and think, okay, what is appropriate to these? And most of the serifs would be appropriate to vintage, authentic, old-fashioned, nostalgia, except maybe the more sort of display type ones like Super Clarendon or some more other kind of display fonts that are very distinctive. With the sans serif, some of these could work, but the more geometric modernist fonts are probably not going to be in the right ballpark. Similar with this soft drinks, it's about elegance, but at the same time being inexpensive, and it's a worldwide thing, so it's a mass market thing, a soft drink. So most of the serifs are probably going to be out, but you can see how with that element of elegance, you start to make judgment calls that maybe Plantin works where Baskerville doesn't. Maybe something like Super Clarendon works, but Bodoni is just too refined and it leans too much towards a luxury, not a mass market affordable item. Most of the sans will work, but Unica might look a bit too utilitarian, so you maybe want to avoid that. Won't have that friendliness that you're looking for. This scuba diving company, that again is for people on a budget, but they want excitement, but they want to be approachable. So probably the serifs, most of those are going to be out in this sense. However, maybe some sort of alternative, not one of these, a serif or some sort of display font can definitely still work. But most of the sans serifs are probably going to be applicable too. So you need to know these go-tos well, how to typeset them, and then begin to trial them out. So a couple of the choices here, like for this scuba training, maybe Futura and Haarskrotes, which, is basically Helvetica, I should have said. You start to look at these and you think about the functionality of body copy. That's essential, being legible for those. And that should be your default option, something that works. And then think about, where we're going to diverge from that and mess with the typesetting. So what about if we felt Futura maybe works better, and then we'll try typesetting the headlines in all caps, in the bold weight. So you maybe lay some of these out and just see if your go-to typefaces can answer the brief. I mentioned about that perhaps an alternative could work for this display font for this scuba brief. And I want to really encourage you, don't neglect serifs. The simplistic, when we're first learning about fonts, is serifs are the old style fonts that were chiseled in stone. So they're all about nostalgia and heritage and history. And if you want to do something modern, then use the sans serif because they were designed later in history. But that really limits you, and that's not necessarily true. As things develop, it's about how you bring all the elements together. Think of something like this phone. If you were to do a brand identity or build a website that was going to sell this phone, it's a modern phone, it's a new design. This is actually the Nothing phone that you might have seen. There's been a lot of hype about it, and it's got these LED lights on the back, and they're trying to do something different, and they are very much selling that narrative that this is something fresh and exciting. So you might think modern, therefore sans serif, but if you actually look at their website, they have this kind of dot matrix logo, but look at the headline type where it reads Pure Instinct. That's actually a serif. So just thinking modern sans serif is too simplistic, so we need to move beyond that. And this is a more modern style serif. The serifs are quite short on it, and you see they've paired that actually with a monospace font. That's ones where each character takes up the same amount of horizontal width, which is not what you normally do in a font. Like usually a lowercase w would be a lot wider than say a lowercase j. And it's another panel from the website. You can see with these quotes along the top, these reviews, it's set in this serif font. And because it has these, it's still got these modern elements, it's got this quite tall X height to it, which helps it read well. It's nice and open, and it looks modern, and it looks fresh, and it puts forward the design-led aspect of the company by doing something that's got a little bit of style and a little bit of design to it, instead of, for example, just using Helvetica, or going with like something that looks very much like Apple, which is a competitor that they would be positioned against. Another project, just to show you briefly, like Open Web. Again, this is something online, it's digital, it's about web publishing, it's not newspapers. So you might think modern sans serif, but actually, again, an elegant serif with very open counters, quite tall X height, and these small serifs. It just gives a clean and modern feel, and it works really well, but it just gives it some more distinctiveness and some more personality. And if they were to just use Proxima Nova or Avenir or Roboto, like so many websites do, and they work perfectly well, but it would lose some of its identity here, and it's given an identity by using a serif font in this instance. So it's all about mood and emotion. And so the next step is to look for upgrades. Now, starting with go-to fonts is a massive time saver. We don't want to be just opening a program and just like scrolling through all the fonts that we have on our computer, or scrolling through a huge library of fonts like Google or Adobe. You want to start with your go-to, and you want to start with that written brief so you have an idea of what you're looking for. And by the time you get to this stage of looking for upgrades, you know exactly the kind of thing that you need. Can you improve, or maybe ask yourself, how could you improve on what you have, given that you've firstly limited yourself to just a small set of fonts, maybe ones you're immediately familiar with? What are the limitations of your go-to selections? Would a more distinctive font be more desirable? Perhaps you could bring a bit more personality through, or a bit more identity, make it more distinctive with a more distinctive font that's less common. So it could be something like this layout, where this display face, where it reads 2017 to 2022, an anniversary, gives it some visual interest in this piece when it's paired with these other sans serif fonts, which are also quite interesting. These small, wide type, if you can see that. But that display face really adds visual interest. Or something like this identity design by Pentagram for this brewery. This is distinctive enough, this headline type, and it's also got enough aesthetic quality to become the primary element of the brand identity. They just rely on this font because it has that distinctiveness and enough quality to it that they can really just lean into that. Again, if here they were just to use a reliable font like Proxima Nova, that's not going to be enough here to establish the identity. But by using something like this display font, which is much more distinctive, it does so. And it also can be just something slightly different, like a simple sans, just moving away from these most common choices. That can be really make a change. I mean, can you tell the difference between these grotesques? They're all transitional sans serif fonts, but these slight differences can really be the thing that just lifts a design, that elevates it. Or it could be a quality upgrade. Don't use Arial. Instead of using Arial or Verdana, you can use something like Helvetica, Proxima Nova that we mentioned, and that can just be that little bit of quality upgrade that can really help you, or something from an independent type foundry that just helps it stand out in that subtle way. And it's not that the average viewer can tell the difference between a transitional sans serif designed by an independent type foundry and Helvetica, they maybe can't. But the overall aesthetic, I really believe, and I'm going to stand by it as a designer, does make an impact on the viewer. And these details are important, aren't they? We care about these things, and that's why we spend our life watching videos about fonts. So look for upgrades. Where should you look? Well, you need to think about what are your available options. So do you have a budget for this project? It's a pretty important question. If not, you're going to need freely available fonts. And that means not just ones that people will let you download on your computer without a credit card, but making sure you've got the appropriate licenses. This is really important. It's a legal issue. It's also an ethical issue, and something we want to support other people in our industry. And type designers do brilliant work. They are very, very skilled, and we should support them by making sure that we have the correct licensing for the fonts. So that's an important thing to be aware of and to make your client aware of and to check. So based on your budget, you can think about where to look. Now, one of the most abundant sources of freely available fonts is Google Fonts, and I made another video about that, entitled Google Fonts Suck, because some Google fonts suck and some of them are average and some of them are really, really good. And that's true about most things. Like when you've got, 1,400 type families, you're always going to get that sort of distribution. But this is an incredible resource. And if you're just looking at this A to Z, you're probably going to struggle. So you might think about using these search features where, for example, let's just look at the display fonts that we're particularly looking for here, the specific upgrade that we need in our written brief. Or it could be start looking at things like the most popular fonts. That'll just give you a clue, what other designers think and the choices that they've made. And they might be ones that you want to then consider. Adobe Fonts is a great resource too. If you have a Creative Cloud subscription, they are included with that. And they have a lot of these little pages that they put together where they have examples. You can see all these colors and different type settings, so you can get a little bit of an idea of some of the feel of how these things might work. Even when you go on to their discovery pages, again, you can categorize whether you're looking for a slab serif and how heavy you want it to be and how wide you want it to be. And so there's quite a lot of detail here. So it's always good to have that in mind. We want to use our brain first to think about what we want, and that's going to save time, and then narrow down those choices and find something appropriate. You have the big type libraries like Monotype. So if you want something like Alternate Gothic, Baskerville, Franklin Gothic, Luberon, Helvetica, Univers, things like that, Monotype, Linotype, these are the guys to go to for that kind of thing. And then independent type foundries. Now, something platform that Ran on the channel likes to recommend a lot is YouWork for them. And the reason is that they collect fonts from all different type foundries, and then they create these images where it gives you some sense of the feel straight away, rather than just seeing alphabets or, the quick brown fox set in black and white every time. They've used some colors, they've put other graphics, the typesetting. It's a little bit quicker for you to just kind of look at the feel. Now, I don't like being led too much by this kind of thing because I'm a bit worried it's going to influence into my design. But I think as you're learning and you are looking for fonts and trying to see where they fit and make that leap of imagination between seeing, an alphabet and then how that's going to impact the emotion of his design. These sorts of things are really helpful. And obviously the fact that they gather fonts from lots of different places. And finally, would be independent type foundries, and this is House Industries, some of their display faces, and it's good to get to know your favorites, different independent type foundries. So if you want something that's a really distinctive, it looks like sign painted or handwritten, that kind of thing, House are a great source for that kind of thing. But there's dozens and dozens of type foundries that I love and I tend to go to. One would be Pangram that we're going to have a little look at now in some practical examples. And you can have there more of a curated collection. So type foundries might have 6 fonts or 40 fonts, and it's a much smaller list to go through. And often they have, an aesthetic or an approach that you just like, or you've used one of their other fonts and it was very, very reliable when you got into the details, so you trust them when it comes to another one that it's going to be really well put together. The metric kerning will have been done properly and things like that. So having a little bit of a look here at Pangram, this font formula, this typeface I should say, has stood out to me. This is a versatile typeface with a bold, racy look, flexibility of a grotesque, impactful statement. So I think for our scuba diving brand, this might be a good option. So a bit of an upgrade on Futura, getting something more distinctive, but that's still going to work really hard for us. And so looking at this typeface, I'd maybe typeset it with some different widths and weights. So maybe try all caps for this more condensed one at the top, and then there's a slightly wider one that's slightly bolder, and then at the bottom the widest one, which is I think in medium weight. I think the body copy is as well. This is just because with this trial set there's like a limited amount of fonts within it, so I'm just trying out a few of them here for the purposes of this video, just as we would normally. Now, intermission. Okay, you might be thinking, this is great, thank you, but how do I know which fonts are good? Well, the thing is, designers have knowledge, skill, and taste. So you need to increase your knowledge about fonts and then develop your skill in typesetting and using them within your layouts. But also there's a subjective element of taste. So it's not just making sure that, this is legible and how it works really well on screen, or I know how to typeset it properly, but it's also that element of taste where you're able to discern something that is aesthetically pleasing, that has the right visual impact, that sets the right mood. And you develop this by developing your taste. And so it's important with a video like this I'm sharing my process that I go through, and it takes a lot longer to explain really than it does to do. I see a brief and I straight away begin to think, I need a display face for that. I'm going to use a humanist sans serif for the body. These things come to mind quickly when it's something you do all the time. But there's always going to be that element where your knowledge, skill, and taste, the things you develop, and watching videos like this can help with it. But you develop that through experience over your career and then make judgments. That said, I want to help you practically. So we're going to talk about how to evaluate fonts. So we want to evaluate fonts versus the brief. So are they appropriate for the thing we're trying to do? That's what we've been talking about in the first few steps. Then we want to evaluate the font, because it might be a great font but not good for our brief, and it might not be a good font for your use case. So again, here there are more objective and more subjective decisions. It's a continuum. So we can say objectively in a certain font the lowercase l and the uppercase I and the one numeral are different characters instead of just lines like they are in some fonts. Therefore, this aids with readability. So that's an objective fact. But then when it comes to, is this font more legible than the other, and we can get into the vagaries of that and why they are, then we start getting towards, this font is playful, this font is serious, this font is luxury, this font is exciting. Then it starts to move more towards the subjective, and it can get ridiculous. And you say Comic Sans is refined and rarefied, and you're struggling to make that argument. But obviously there's a continuum of how objective and subjective these sorts of decisions are, but you need to think about your use case. So there might be practical concerns. If you're doing something like a website, does it need to be published in multiple languages? Well, make sure the font supports all the languages. Make sure it's got a full set of glyphs, so all the accents and umlauts and tildes and everything that you need are there. to reproduce those languages. You would think about the audience. That might be play into issues to do with legibility, or it could just be for the feel too. Is it a full set of characters? And is it a full font family? So have you got italics? And remember, italics are not just slanted characters. Italics are separately designed characters that have a different emphasis, and things about them are different. The lowercase a's are different in uprights to italics, so things like that. Does it have a range of weights? So if you've just got one weight, that's limiting. If you have regular and bold, it's better than one. But if you have a whole range of weights, or it's maybe a variable font, is becoming common now on the web, then you've got a lot more options there. Do you have a range of widths within the typeface? Even better, you go from condensed and narrows to wides and extended fonts. Then we've got further options there. So think about your use case and the practical considerations and the more design-led aesthetic considerations for that. It might be a good font, but it might not be a good font versus the brief and your use case. Next, you want to look at fonts by their source. We mentioned before, if something's free, some of the things are going to be great, a lot are going to be average, and some are going to be complete trash. Applies to anything. So if something has some more fences in the way, like you have to be part of a subscription or you have to pay to license the fonts, it gives you some indication of quality. Now, you still need to evaluate that for yourself. But for example, if there's an independent type founder you go to that only sell 12 fonts, you've used 3 of them on projects extensively and they were all brilliant, and they then release a new font, well, you can have some confidence it's going to have a similar level of quality control. So it gives you some idea. You can also look by recommendation. So these curated places, these platforms where there are lists of fonts, fonts that are popular, like we mentioned before for searching, that's a crowdsourced means of recommendation. Websites and blogs that would recommend fonts. Now look at these lists. You know, if they recommend 10 fonts and straight away you're looking and you think 3 or 4 of them are pretty ugly, then maybe don't take their recommendations on the other ones. But it's something that you can do. You can look at recommendations list designers can put together. At least it can narrow down some options for you, and you can always ask a friend. By testing, so this is something that you want to do, particularly if it's something new, is just do some typesetting. You know, set some paragraphs out, make it small, make it big, look at it on your phone. Make sure you've got different characters. Just look at the kerning when it's just set, you know, metrically, it's set with the kerning that's in the font, how that looks, and just try things out and see if you run into any sort of issues. When you start getting characters, you know, running into each other and some kind of ugly kerning going on, or just finding out that some of the characters, you know, aren't very clear what they're supposed to be, things like that, or they just don't reduce very well in size, then you know it's not going to be for you. You can also evaluate fonts by comparison. So this is something that I love to do. I'll take a font and I'll put it next to a classic in that area. So if I'm looking at a transitional sans serif, I'm going to put that next to Helvetica. If I'm looking at an old style, I'm going to put that next to Garamond. And this thing, it just really helps you. You notice, oh, it's got a taller X height, or the characters are generally wider, or the counters are more open, or just different little details that will just help you evaluate the font and see where the designers made decisions to diverge from some of the classics, and that might make you think about it being a more appropriate choice in your instance. And finally, you can evaluate fonts by eye. So in other words, just manually. So prior knowledge is required, and all these things I've mentioned before now are to try and help you to get to this point where you can look at fonts very quickly and make some of these judgments. And this requires some knowledge of type anatomy, classification that we talked about before. What kind of font is it? If you know it's a slab serif straight away, or a monospaced, or then getting into the detail like a humanist versus a transitional sans serif, that will help you evaluate it, because you know kind of the ballpark, like where it's supposed to be, what this thing is. And look at the characteristics of the font. When you learn this sort of stuff, type design is a good thing to lean into, even if you're not thinking of, designing, big type families. This is a really good book, actually, Designing Type, which is by Karen Cheng. And that kind of thing, it really gives you an idea, because it gives you all the kind of diagrams of how characters are supposed to look, what they are, the standard way of creating characters and their width and the different stroke thicknesses and things like that. And that will really help you notice where people have diverged or the decisions that they've made, and think about why they've done it. And you get much better than at evaluating fonts by eye. Okay, step 4 of 5 is to trial, pair, and compare. So I really encourage you to use real copy and start typesetting things. If you don't have it, just make it up. And it just gives you a flavor of where this thing is supposed to sit. So we had Futura, and then a few different fonts within this formula typeface that we're trying out, and just look at them next to each other and just see which you feel is a strong option, and how these things work together, headlines and body copies. So how do you pair fonts? That's a bad joke, isn't it? Okay, here's a few tips. You can pair fonts from the same typeface, sometimes called font families. So this is just one font, Archivo Regular. So it's the regular width, the regular weight. But other fonts within that would be like Archivo Semi-Bold. So now we've got a different weight. Now, when you're pairing weights, I recommend you go up at least 2 weights. So we've gone from regular to medium to semi-bold. So at least 2 weights to get that difference in between a medium and a regular. A light and a regular can be a little bit too close. And then we could go up more than 2 weights and we start to get more of a contrast. I quite like what's going on here. Or we could choose a different width within this same typeface, so the condensed extra bold Archivo. And I quite like this combination now. This is a free Google font, by the way, which is kind of got some similar features to Formula that we picked out, a little bit square. And this is a typeface that has lots of width and weight, so it gives us this opportunity to look at those sort of pairings. So you can pair fonts from the same typeface, or pair 2 or 3 distinct typefaces. Distinct, they need to be different. And so if you're bringing more than 2 or 3, and I would say probably never use more than 2 or 3 distinct typefaces in a layout. Certainly, maybe within a project or a brand identity, something like that. It's going to be too many if we get more than 3. I would avoid pairing similar fonts. They need to be distinctive, similar in a way of being there being a dissonance or a clashing. So let me show you that. So something like Poppins, Century Gothic, and Futura, which are all geometric. Like Poppins and Century Gothic are very similar, as you can see here, but they're not the same, and that is a problem, because it's like a clash. It's like a color clash. You got 2 colors together and they're not quite working, and it just gives a little uneasy feel. Similarly with these serifs, although one is an old style and a couple of them are transitional, the thing is they're still too similar, and it just doesn't feel like it marries together. If you're going to put this in a magazine or on a website, we need some distinction here. So this would be a better way to use it. So if we just go back one, we had Plantain for the headline. Well, if we actually used Plantain for the H1 and the body copy, but we used the regular for the body, you can see bold condensed for the headline, we get a nice combination. And then you could bring something in like Neuhaus Grotesque, Helvetica, and that gives us a nice little range here of things where these are clearly different. You're not confusing these two things. So They don't give that uneasy feeling by them being similar but not quite the same, and we're not sure why it feels a little bit strange. So I would say a good rule with this kind of thing is when you're pairing fonts is to have only one decorative typeface per layout. And I would only use decorative type for either headlines or as a decorative element, like a huge numeral, like I've been doing as we lead into these steps, or as a background element or something graphical. But one decorative typeface max, and pair that with some more neutral type, so you don't have too many crazy things going on at the same time. You want to develop a design system for your pairs so there's a consistency. So if that is a website, developing clearly your H1, H2, H3, etc., your body copies, your captions, the same thing would apply through a magazine, and that will help you develop that level of consistency and allow the typefaces to work together rather than it just being like this mad visual jumble which just ends up like a visual noise. You can also pair typefaces with complementary features. So we just talked about being distinctive, different from each other. Now we're talking about being complementary. So it appears there's maybe a contradiction here. So let's try and work through that. So something like this. Here, these things are clearly different. Optima, Adorn Garland, which is from Google, and IBM Plex Mono, which is also available on Google. They're definitely distinct, but does that make them a good pair? No, because they just have a completely different mood. They're like from a different era. To have a monospace font and then something that mimics calligraphy is a really strange combination. And there's probably some scenario in which it would work, but in general, these don't jive together. So you want to think about the overall mood, maybe fonts that were designed in the same time period or have the aesthetic of a certain type period, or they just have the same style, they're evoking similar sort of emotions, or they're going to work together, or one which is more neutral, like something like Universe, which has that neutrality to it and it allows you to pair with it more expressive fonts. So we want things that are complementary. So let's look at some examples of that. So we talked about recommendations, but we actually wrote and designed a free ebook, which is the best Google fonts for every mood. We'll also put a link to that in the description of this video if you want to grab it. And let me take you through some of these examples. So we talked about different moods, like something technical, like we think of software, technology, digital, that kind of space. So like one of the options we threw in was using Roboto Serif and Roboto Sans. Now, I mentioned here that commercial type actually designed Roboto Serif, and I really, really like this. And they have thought about some of the feels, some of the proportions, some of the details of Roboto, like how the O's are a little bit squared off, and or on the shoulder of all the characters as well, like you say with the E's, and that's picked up in the serif. So these have got complementary features, but they're clearly different enough because one's a serif, it's got this humanist kind of thick and thin, even though it's got almost like slab-like serifs. So it's kind of in between, and they work together, but they're clearly different from one another. So they make a nice combination because they've got complementary features, a similar anatomy. So when you get into the detail of this, you start picking up things like similar X heights or similar features, like just similar curves or different elements that can just be complementary and kind of make them look like they're part of the same family, like they fit together, like they belong together in the same place. In this handcrafted section, we choose a font like this one, which is Laura, and I recommend that a great way to pair fonts is to pick one font and then find a pair for it. If you're trying to think, oh, I need two fonts that work together, choose that one that's going to work really well for you. So it might be choosing a body copy that is in the right kind of feel, but you know it's very functional, then looking for a display face which is in the right ballpark, or often the other way around where you choose your headline and then you find some body to support it. So this Laura works well, but then chose Rubik for body copy because of It's just has a little bit of this handcrafted feel, this distinctiveness. It's a little bit non-traditional, so it doesn't look too utilitarian. We don't want this to look like an instruction manual. This is for example, this handcrafted feel, like a clothing brand, like, or as we go into this next example, we've got things that feel like they're in that same era. I've said, so it's Roboto again, but I think it was the only one I used twice in this book, but or maybe Archivo, but it looks like that mid-century kind of thing. Like Ultra could almost be like 70s. It's a bit mad, and having this combination here again, where we've got the super heavy with the regular weight, contrasting weights, but things that look like they belong from a similar era. Here's some examples of that, how that would kind of, play out and work together. You can see on this menu that they can work really well practically. Again, luxury, serif is where we maybe associate, but also like the fashion house thing of bold. So again, the combination here, different weights, fonts which are clearly distinctive from one another. With this hip direction, I think this is the last example, we've got Archivo expanded black. So again, it's wide and it's heavyweight, so that distinguishes itself from this regular width, regular weight body copy. So it just helps with the graphical appearance as well as the hierarchy. But both of these fonts, because it's expanded and heavyweight, that has a contemporary feel. It feels like it's quite a current thing, but also using this Space Grotesque, which again has these very modern features like the weird straight bottom on the G and things like that, the leg of the G. These kind of things just make them feel contemporary and a little bit edgy, so they belong together, but we've stuck to certain rules about contrasting them as well when we put them together. And the final thing, let me run over briefly, step 5. This has been a marathon tutorial, really, not a little throwaway YouTube video, so I hope it's been helpful. Is to test and test again, to design and typeset as many things as possible to ensure that your choices work across all relevant applications. Don't just have a little bit of lorem ipsum and a headline and think, yeah, I like that one, and you're done. It's start putting them into layouts. So quickly put something together, like a quick hero section for this website. So we've gone with this formula, and now I think this really has the feel of something which is distinctive enough. It's not just, a universe or something like that, which just feels so neutral, but it's definitely legible at the same time. And so it's beginning to see how that works, throw it, onto some posters and things like that, and just see if it works large, if it works small. Print it out. It's a great thing if you've got a printer. It's well worth having one, even if you're a digital designer. Just printing something up, putting it on the wall, seeing what it looks like at different sizes, and try it in different sorts of digital layouts. Test it out on your phone. Do that Figma prototype, open it on your phone, see what it looks like. And these kind of tests are really important to give you confidence in your selections. Number 1, stretch it. Fonts are designed by brilliant type designers who have real skill in crafting typefaces. You can see in this example, on the first row, we have 4 different widths from a typeface, and each of those are individually drawn. Then on the bottom, number 3 is the same size, but then I've used the width number 3 and I've just stretched it to be the same width as each of the options above. And you can see that these weird funky sort of things start to happen. If we go over to the far left with number 1, you can see that the vertical stem of the E is narrower than it should be. You can see it's a bit wider on the top, and similarly but not quite as pronounced there on number 2. Also with the shape of the S, it creates an odd sort of shape instead of the more elegant forms of the top, where the weighting of everything is proper. You see also with the T that same problem, where the vertical stem is narrower than it should be in relation to the horizontal bar on top. On the far right as well, it's
ugly. The S, number 4, the spine of it doesn't have that elegant swoop that we have on the top. And again, the E and the T get moved out of proportion. Stretching fonts ruins them and breaks them. Like every rule, it's there to be broken, as I talked about in a recent video. It's just about doing that with intention. And that's my whole approach, to learn the rules and then break them. That's why we're here. So this recent project by Only Studio, just from down the road from me in the northwest of England, but they created this for Pirate, who are rehearsal studios and radio space in sort of music relating to up and coming artists. And what they've done is they've used Arial, again a very default font, not the most elegant font, not the most rarefied font, kind of a little bit ridiculed. It's like the poor man's Helvetica, and they've deliberately stretched it through all these different applications, so it just looks wrong. Like, look at the H there on Hackney Wick on the far right. Look here on the E's, we're seeing this problem that we talked about, where we've got these horizontal bars that are far thicker than the vertical stems, and just the how the stroke weight on the C and the O has been totally messed up. And through all these posters and social applications and different things, you can see it's, you know, really makes these fonts look super ugly. But the clever thing about it is that this is very deliberate, and because they've unified other elements, because it's mainly black and white and this sort of point of view photography that's a little bit desaturated, it has a holistic look to the whole thing. And it also means that they can get away with breaking this rule, because the website, the brand, sorry, is called Pirate. It fits with it. It fits with this sort of DIY aesthetic that's very rough and ready. So it actually produces a desired effect. But in general, it creates all these kind of problems, and stretching fonts is something you want to avoid. Number 2, inappropriate situation. It might be a good font, but you're using it in the wrong context. This Google font Ultra can work really well in this little mock-up that I've created for this vegan restaurant. But if we were to apply it to something like Swiss watches, it just doesn't fit in the scenario. And if we move to something that is more what we would expect to see in this category, you can see how it doesn't offend, it doesn't stand out, and it really is just much more appropriate choice. So it might be a good font, that doesn't mean it's good in every situation. For example, you wouldn't use a script type on a road sign. Number 3, insufficient contrast. So this can be both the weight of the font. So because the top example here is a very lightweight, at this size for body copy, it's difficult to read. That's rectified in the second one. The bottom one is the same as the second, but obviously the background color changing just means the contrast is super low. Now, you might think this is an extreme example, but it's something you see on websites all the time where type is difficult to read, and it's not something that you have to fight with. Just use a contrast checker. This free one here is one that you can use. There's our bottom example, and then our middle example, you can see green means very good. It's much better. And there's also one for Adobe. You can get plugins for Figma, so you can have this with you while you're working, but there's no excuse for it really. There needs to be sufficient contrast with the color of the type, as in the thickness of it, and also the actual color that you choose for your background and to set the font in. Number 4, ill-considered point sizes. We have to think about these things deliberately. So our body copy shouldn't be too small to read, nor too large to read comfortably. And if you're designing a website, you need to make sure you check that, test that across all different screen sizes. And then having some sort of relationship. When you've got too many font sizes on a website, on a poster, in a catalog, it just starts to look strange. It starts to look disordered, and there's a little clashing. So just having a set number of sizes or a set relationship between the sizes, like a geometrical or a mathematical relationship, really help. Even the standard sizes that you get in, you know, you've seen it in a word processor, you see it in your design software where it's like 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, 18, might be 21 in there, or 24, 36, 48, 60, 72. That's based on the actual when type, you know, was a physical thing that typesetters used to lay out. They were the sizes, the point sizes they'd have in their case. but they're useful because there's actually a relationship there between them. And I think a lot of digital designers often throw around all these different weird point sizes, and it can lead to a little bit of a mess. So try and have some order to your point sizes. Number 5, unsuitable tracking. So tracking is the space between all the characters on a line. So you can see at the top, wider tracking, that's 200. And the second line there, we have narrower tracking on 10. And when you track lowercase type widely, it looks odd. It's difficult to read. So I would start with 0 for body copy, or all your type really, and then just adjust it accordingly. Does it need to go a little bit narrower? Like, the general rule is the larger your type, the tighter the tracking wants to be. You want to pull that in a little bit because the spaces in between the characters look larger as the type actually point size increases. So something to look at. But I often see this widely tracked body copy type on websites. Makes it really difficult to read. Don't do that. Widely tracked type, I think only maybe for uppercase in logos, in certain headlines and things like that can be acceptable. Number 6, substandard kerning. So whereas tracking is the space between all the characters on a line, kerning is the space between 2 individual characters or glyphs. So these examples, the top one, the kerning is set to metric, and in Adobe software they use these 2 terms. So metric is what's set by the type designer in the typeface. It's usually what you want to start with. And on the bottom one, the kerning is optical. So in general, I would use metric kerning for body copy. For headlines, I like to kern those manually, just adjust the space between the letters. Optical means to the eye, and this is the software having its best go at kerning. You can see it's just tightened it up, how much shorter the words kerning are on the second line than the one above, even though it's both the same font and the same point size. And if you want to practice your kerning and get better at it so you can get really sharp headlines or crafted logos, I really recommend the kerning game on the Method of Action website. And this is a fun way to do it, and because there's so many different fonts there, it really gives you a feel of how you do that with sans and with serif and display fonts, and go nuts with that. Number 7, inappropriate line length. So we don't want this to be too long or too short again. So on the first top line, this is too long and our head's kind of on a swivel like we're watching tennis at Wimbledon. We don't want the reader to do that. We want a nice scannable length, and we don't want it either to be too short like the one at the bottom where it's something like about 4 or 5 words on a line. That's too few usually. Start pushing that up to 7, you maybe go up to 12 or 15. It really depends on the context, but if you look at like websites, these are a great example. So this is how this site looked in full screen on my 5K monitor, the CNN travel website. And because it is such a large site, they haven't used that full width, because if the line length was like the full width of my screen, they know that would be really difficult to read. So they've brought in the width of this whole column so that it creates a sensible line length for the type, and you should do that too. Number 8, ill-judged leading. So leading is also known as line height on the web. So they used to put physical pieces of lead in between the lines of type, which is the way you remember how it's pronounced and what it means. And you can see here with 100% leading, so that means if your type is at 14 point, you would have 14 point leading. That's 100%. You can see that they're a little bit tight to one another, these lines, and it makes it harder to scan. But if we just open that up a little bit to 130%, which is where I like to start with body copy type, it makes it a lot easier to read. When you start getting larger than that, depending on the font, like we have at the bottom with 200, it's not always clear that that type is part of one unit. Now there are big spaces here, but within a layout, that could be strange. It's harder to read and it doesn't have the right grouping to it. So that's something to start with around 120, 130%, and then adjust it dependent on the font and the point size and the situation you're in. Number 9, inconsistent casing. This one just winds me up. We see this sort of writing on the web all the time. Which words in this title are going to be capitalized? If you see that sort of heading on like the title of a YouTube video, or the big caption on a social media post, or headline on a website, on some sites it just seems to be like at random, as I've done here, like how they make these decisions. Or in this paragraph where it's like, oh, this is, the mission is a thing, so I'm going to give it a capital M, and then I'm going to put some words in capitals because, you know, they're really important and I want them to stand out. It just looks really nasty. It looks amateurish. It looks cheap. It looks pushy. Just stick to good grammar, whatever language you're working in, and generally just use sentence case. You can use title case, but be consistent with it. You can use all cap, but I would start with sentence case and just make sure your casing is consistent throughout. Even if it's something you get from copywriters and clients, it's something you can push back on, and proper grammar is always going to look better. Number 10, multiple emphasis. One emphasis is plenty. So we don't need bigger sail to be anything else than in a different weight. So making it a different weight and italic and underline and in a different color, this makes it again look cheap and nasty and pushy. You want to avoid multiple emphasis. So we rarely need bold italic when it's within a regular upright body copy. We don't really need things to be underlined and bold. Just choose an emphasis and even stick with that through paragraphs or through sections if it is necessary. You see in books, italic tends to be the only emphasis that's really used. Number 11, too many at once. Using too many different fonts in the same composition. So look at something like OpenAI's site. Here there appears to be just two fonts. We have, apart from the logo, we have this sans serif font, which appears to be the same way all the way through in the menu items at the top, and also this short paragraph and link. And then we have a totally different typeface, this serif typeface, for the title of Safety and Responsibility. And this is a nice contrasting pair, and it works because we've not got too many things going on here. But in this like butchered example, if we change the font for the body copy and the button, now we've got 4 different fonts going on plus 5 with the logo. This thing starts to look really messy. Here's the before, how it should be, and here's the messy one with too many in there. You want to limit to, I would say, 2-3 fonts. Start with that until you become, you know, a real master typographer. If you've been designing type for 40 years, you're probably not watching this video unless it's just for entertainment. If you're learning, start with 2 or 3, and I mean fonts, not just typefaces. So different font, Helvetica Bold is a different font to Helvetica Regular, whereas Helvetica and Garamond, they're 2 different typefaces. So it's a whole set of fonts that make up a typeface. And so even with that, you don't want to use too many. If you're using Helvetica Bold, Helvetica Regular, Helvetica Italic, you don't necessarily want to use Garamond Bold, Garamond Regular, Garamond Italic, you know, too many things going on. Just really limit that within a composition. And the final one, number 12, is unsuitable pairing. So we just saw an example of a nice pairing, but this can go wrong. Like here, back to this display font Ultra that we talked about before. If we pair that with something like Plantin, this serif font here, it's a bit uneasy because we've got these different types of serifs, and we've got this thing Ultra, which is very much like of a time. It kind of looks like a 70s thing. It's very stylized. Then you've got this very classic serif, and it doesn't really work. So you probably want to go something that feels a lot more generic, like Unica, a sans serif, that really pairs well with anything. This is a grotesque sans serif, and that will kind of go well with everything.
Number 1, successful designers know more than software. I studied graphic design from the ages of 14 to 16 as my technology option in high school, but it was when I learned to hand code websites that I really became interested in web design. At first, I just wanted to make a website for the terrible indie band I was playing in. I thought more people needed to hear our music. They really didn't. Then when I got to university, I ended up building a blog that a family member who was a developer saw, and then asked me to design a front-end interface for a product he was building. And that was when I quickly realized I didn't know what I was doing. Knowing HTML and CSS and how to operate some basic software is not enough. Designers need to know the fundamental principles behind good design. That's why here at Flux we do more than software tutorials. We continue to emphasize the core design skills that you need to succeed. In fact, that's the title, Core Design Skills, of the new program we're working on. Mastering layout, type, color, imagery, having a solid process to follow is essential if you want to be a web designer. Number 2, successful designers work at speed. In 2004, I started working full-time as a graphic and web designer, and the following year I landed my first job at an agency. The portfolio I had cobbled together was apparently adequate to land me the job, but my very first day I had a scary realization. I was so slow. I hadn't mastered the core design skills, so I was simply moving things around till they looked right, and that wasn't going to cut it in a busy studio. So from that first evening, and then for several months, I spent all day after work in the evenings practicing, learning, repeating software shortcuts, discovering new techniques, schooling myself in the principles, copying from the senior designer I was working with. It was intense, but I quite literally got myself up to speed. Number 3, successful designers solve problems. After leaving the city and moving to a web design agency for a short while, I then went in-house, taking on a more general leadership and creative role. And if you want to achieve anything significant, you have to be prepared to take responsibility. The person who makes mistakes rarely makes anything else. The essence of design is to solve problems. That's what separates designers from visual artists. A successful designer looks for problems, embraces problems, knowing the creative act can overcome. Number 4, successful designers sell big ideas. Whilst working in-house, I co-founded a music industry-based creative agency and grew my role from spare time to part-time to full-time, and what I discovered there became my touchstone for every project I take on. Successful designers create and sell big ideas. We went into competitive pitching scenarios for everything from advertising campaigns to live production, and in those presentations we needed to leave potential clients with the most memorable and compelling concept. Our job is not to make pretty things, it's to communicate. So find that big idea that will illuminate your concept, because that's what people will buy and what will ultimately make it work. Number 5, successful designers don't rely on their process. I sold out of my agency to my business partner and went to run the graphics side of the studio for a notable creative director, fashion designer, couture level fashion, high profile music artists, publications like Vogue and Hypebeast we were creating for, and this solidified my own design philosophy about conceptual work and restraint, clear reasoning. And the creative director not only had a brilliant imagination, but also a relentless commitment to quality. I thought all designers were detail-oriented, but this was on another level. And there was something he always said to everyone in the studio: don't trust your process, check. How can mistakes creep in if I take care? Well, they do. So check everything. Have someone else check it. Consistency of colors, point sizes, cleanliness of code, spelling, check. And finally, number 6, successful designers don't let admin trip them up. I have a brilliant client that keeps coming back, and one of the managers there said recently to their colleague, "Oh, Matt's great, he's super organized." Now, I wish they'd said super creative or skilled, but you know what? Clients want someone who's easy to work with. When your design is just a hobby, these things don't matter. But when you become a professional, you need to have the proper insurance, track your time, keep physical and cloud backups, financial records, keep your files organized, so organized that another designer could pick them up and understand them. It might not be exciting, but these are the kind of things that clients appreciate, and if they're not in place, can trip you up, sometimes very painfully. I hope this helps you get you to where you want to be quicker than I did, and that's why Flux Academy exists, to help you succeed as a designer. Hopefully these pointers that I never had can be things to look out for and practice and seek out as you progress in your career.
If you made it this far, first of all, well done for sticking with it. I can tell that you're committed to becoming a better graphic designer. Your next steps would be to get practicing and have a look at our Core Design Skills program. Just follow the link in the description, and until next time, happy designing.